Hello, welcome to Nytheric Horror. Tonight, enjoy 3 hours of true scary stories, mysterious encounters, and disturbing experiences. Ads may play during the first 15 minutes and after 2:30 sounded, with no mid-roll ads in between. Turn off the lights, close your eyes, and let the nightmare begin. I took the summer job because it paid better than anything else I could find as a sociology undergrad, and because the listing made it sound almost glamorous. Archival work at a private estate that had been donated to the university decades earlier and was now used to store historical records nobody had gotten around to digitizing yet. The pay was decent, the hours were regular, and I told myself it would look good on a resume. What the listing didn't mention, and what I only pieced together over my first few weeks there, was exactly what kind of estate it had been before the university took it over, and exactly what kind of records I would end up spending my summer filing. The house itself was enormous, the kind of place you only see in old photographs or period films. 3 stories of gray stone with narrow windows and a slate roof, set back from the road behind a stand of overgrown hedges that had clearly once been kept trimmed into something formal, and were now just wild, dark green walls pressing in on the long gravel drive, tall enough in places to block any view of the road from the upper windows. It had belonged, I learned eventually, to a wealthy family for most of the 20th century. A family who had used part of the house, quietly, discreetly, the way wealthy families sometimes did in that era, to care for a relative whose mind had never worked the way the rest of the world expected it to. The family had converted an entire wing of the house, the east wing, into something between a private residence and a private institution, complete with its own staff, its own routines, and its own locked doors. When the last of the family line died out without an heir, the house passed to the university along with its contents, and the contents, it turned out, were staggering. Decades of medical records, personal correspondence, staff logs, all of it boxed and shelved and left largely untouched in the basement level, beneath the east wing, waiting for someone with more time than money to go through it and decide what deserved to be preserved. That someone, that summer, was me and one other intern. A quiet, serious young woman named Priya, who was studying archival science and took the whole thing far more seriously than I initially did. Our supervisor, a harried university employee who split her time between 3 different collections across the region, gave us a single afternoon of orientation and then largely left us to our own devices, which meant that for most of that summer it was just the 2 of us, alone in that enormous house, working our way through boxes of paper that documented, in exhausting bureaucratic detail, the life of a man who had spent most of his adult years locked inside it, moving room by room through a history that neither of us had signed up to inherit. I want to be honest and tell you that my interest, at first, was purely academic. I liked the idea of tracing a family's private history through paperwork, liked the small satisfaction of putting things in chronological order, liked feeling, in a small way, like a detective piecing together something nobody else had bothered to look at closely in decades. It was only a few weeks in, once I'd started actually reading some of the material instead of just filing it, that the academic interest curdled into something heavier. I found an old newspaper clipping tucked inside a folder that had nothing to do with it, misfiled decades earlier by someone who clearly hadn't been paying close attention. It was a short article, a few paragraphs, about a woman named Patricia, who had spent years trying to get her son released from private care, writing letters, hiring lawyers, pleading with doctors who never seemed to take her seriously. The article mentioned, almost in passing, that her son had died inside the house in the 1970s, that the family had always maintained it was a tragic accident, and that Patricia herself had gone to her grave insisting it was something else entirely, that her son had died afraid, convinced the people caring for him meant him harm, and that nobody had listened to her when it might have mattered. I read that article 3 times before I put it down. I remember sitting there in the basement archive room with the clipping in my hands, feeling a kind of cold settle into my chest that had nothing to do with the actual temperature of the room, though the basement level was always cold, regardless of the season, in a way that never fully made sense given how warm the upper floors of the house could get in the summer. Sunlight pouring through those tall old windows all afternoon, while down below, none of that warmth ever seemed to reach us at all. I didn't mention it to Priya. I'm not sure why. I think some part of me wanted to sit with it privately for a while, the way you sit with a piece of bad news before you're ready to say it out loud to someone else. The dream came about 2 weeks after I found that clipping. I want to describe it as precisely as I can, because it has stayed with me in a way most dreams don't. Sharp-edged and complete. None of the usual fog that dreams dissolve into by morning. I was sitting in a chair, in a room I didn't recognize, though something about the proportions of it, the height of the ceiling, the narrow window with its heavy curtain, felt like it belonged somewhere in that house, some room I hadn't personally been in, but that existed within the same walls. Across from me sat an old woman. I knew, without being told, without any explanation offered inside the dream itself, that she was Patricia. She was crying, had clearly been crying for some time before I became aware of her, her face wet and swollen with it, and she was staring directly at me with an intensity that made my whole body feel pinned in place, unable to look away, unable to move. She screamed at me. Not words at first, just raw, wordless grief and fury, the kind of sound that comes from somewhere far below language, and then, gradually, the sound resolved into actual sentences. Though I have only ever been able to remember fragments of what she said, the way you remember fragments of an argument through a wall, rather than the whole thing clearly. She told me I was awful for working there. She told me I didn't understand what I was walking past every single day, what I was filing away into neat little boxes as though it were nothing more than paperwork. She told me, over and over, that nobody had listened to her when it counted, and that now I was doing the same thing, treating her son's entire life and death as an afternoon's administrative task. She screamed at me for what felt, within the dream, like the entire night, her voice never losing strength, never softening. And I sat frozen in that chair the whole time, unable to speak, unable to defend myself, unable even to cry, though I wanted to. I woke up with my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, and it took several long minutes lying in the dark before I could convince myself I was actually in my own bedroom and not still in that chair across from her. My sheets were damp with sweat despite the air conditioning running, and there was a taste in my mouth I couldn't place, metallic and faintly sour. The kind of taste that lingers after real fear rather than after an ordinary bad dream. I did not go back to sleep that night. I lay awake until my alarm went off, turning the fragments of what she'd said over and over in my mind, replaying the exact wetness of her face. The particular rasp her voice had taken on by the end of the screaming, as though she'd worn it raw from decades of saying the same things to people who never once turned around to listen. When I got to work that morning, I found myself avoiding Priya's eyes, half convinced that if I looked at her directly, she would somehow see the whole dream written across my face and ask me about it before I was ready to explain. And I remember being grateful, that particular morning, for how cold the basement stairwell was, because it gave me something physical to focus on, instead of the tightness still sitting behind my ribs. Something ordinary and explainable in a day that already felt anything but. The basement level of the house, where we did most of our work, had originally been divided into a number of separate rooms, each serving a different practical purpose back when the East Wing had functioned as a private care facility rather than an archive. By the time Priya and I started working there, most of those original purposes had been forgotten by everyone except the handful of very old staff logs that occasionally mentioned them in passing, and it became something of a private project of ours over the course of the summer to work out what each room had originally been used for, based on architectural clues and stray references in the paperwork we were filing. Some of it was easy. One room still had the ghost of a tiled floor beneath decades of dust, clearly once a kitchen or cafeteria space, evidenced by the outline of long-removed counters along one wall. Another had narrow iron brackets bolted into the stone at odd intervals near the ceiling, which we eventually decided. With a mixture of academic curiosity and genuine unease, must have once held some kind of restraint or support equipment, though neither of us wanted to think too hard about what exactly that equipment had been for. Every room in that basement corridor was kept locked, heavy old doors with heavier old locks, the kind that required actual iron keys rather than anything modern. Keys that hung on a numbered board just inside the stairwell door and had to be checked out and returned every time we needed access to a particular room. It was, I'll admit, an inconvenient system, and by midsummer Priya and I had developed a rhythm to dealing with it, grabbing whichever keys we needed for the day's filing all at once so we wouldn't have to keep climbing back up the narrow stairs every time we finished with one room and moved to the next. The corridor itself ran the full length of the East Wing's foundation. Low-ceilinged and unevenly lit, a handful of bare bulbs strung along a single wire that buzzed faintly whenever the building's old electrical system had to work harder than usual, and I remember that certain sections of that corridor always felt colder than others. Patches of air you'd walk through that made no logical sense given how far you were from any exterior wall or window. Cold that didn't dissipate, no matter how many times you walked back and forth past the same spot on a hot summer afternoon. About 4 days after my dream, Priya and I were working our way down that basement corridor with a stack of records that needed to be filed away in one of the smaller rooms near the far end, a room we hadn't had reason to open before that day. Priya had the key, and she fitted it into the lock the way she'd done 100 times before with 100 other doors that summer, and turned it. It didn't move. She frowned, jiggled it slightly, tried again, the particular small grunt of effort people make when a lock is being uncooperative rather than genuinely broken. She kept at it for what felt, standing there watching her like a very long time, though it was probably closer to a minute, the key scraping faintly against the tumblers inside without ever quite catching the way it needed to. I don't know exactly when the image came into my head, whether it arrived before she started struggling with the lock or somewhere in the middle of it. But at some point, while I stood there watching Priya work the key back and forth, my own breath fogging faintly in that unexplainable basement cold, I found myself seeing, as clearly and involuntarily as I had seen Patricia across from me in that chair, a young man standing just on the other side of that door. He was tall, thin, wearing clothes that felt old-fashioned even in the vague, half-formed way the image presented itself to me, and he was standing with his back braced against the door itself, one hand pressed flat against the wood at roughly the height where the lock sat, holding it shut with a desperate, focused effort that had nothing to do with the mechanics of the lock and everything to do with will. I understood, in the same wordless, absolute way I had understood who Patricia was in my dream, that he did not want us to come in, that whatever had happened to him inside that room was something he had never stopped experiencing, some endless private moment he was still trapped inside of, and that our presence on the other side of the door felt to him, somehow, like a threat he needed to keep out, an intrusion he had no way of understanding as harmless. I did not say any of this to Priya. I stood there beside her, in the cold, narrow corridor, with that image sitting behind my eyes, and I felt the particular kind of fear that has nowhere to go. Because there was no way to explain it out loud that wouldn't sound insane. No way to say, I think there's a dead man holding this door shut, without sounding like I'd lost my mind entirely. And then, with a sound like a held breath finally releasing, the lock turned. Priya let out a small laugh, more relief than amusement, said something about the mechanism being stiff from disuse, and pushed the door open into a room that was, like all the others, cold and dim and smelling faintly of dust and old paper, though underneath that familiar smell there was something else that day, something faint and organic that neither of us commented on, a closeness to the air that made me want to breathe through my mouth instead of my nose. The single bare bulb overhead took a few seconds to fully catch when Priya pulled the string, flickering weakly before settling into a dim, steady glow that didn't quite reach the corners of the room, leaving them pooled in shadow no matter where we stood. We carried the boxes in, we filed the records into their designated shelves, and I remember my hands were unsteady in a way that had nothing to do with the weight of what I was carrying. A fine, persistent tremor I had to consciously will away every time I reached up to slide a folder into place. I don't remember either of us saying a single word the entire time we were in that room, which was unusual for us, since we usually talked constantly while we worked, comparing notes on whatever strange detail we'd come across that day. That day, we worked in complete silence, moving carefully around each other the way you move in a room where you sense, without being told. That noise would be unwelcome, and I have always suspected, though I've never directly asked her, that Priya felt something in that room too. Something she also didn't know how to put into words. We found out, near the end of the summer, what one of the other basement rooms had originally been used for, and I want to tell you about it, because it is the piece of that summer that has stayed with me the longest, longer even than the dream, longer than the door. There was a room at the very end of the corridor, smaller than the others, with a stone floor that sloped very slightly toward a drain set into one corner. A detail we had both noticed early on, and neither of us had thought much about at the time, filing it away mentally alongside all the other odd architectural leftovers of the building's former life. We found the answer, eventually, in a staff logbook from the 1960s. A dry, bureaucratic record of daily tasks and incidents that occasionally, almost accidentally, revealed something true about the nature of the place. The entry, when we found it, described that room in the flat, procedural language of institutional record-keeping, as the space where deceased patients were prepared before being transported down to the county morgue. The drain in the floor mentioned specifically, in the same clinical tone used to describe supply inventories and shift changes, as being necessary for the cleaning process involved. Priya read that entry out loud to me at the small folding table we used as a desk, her voice going flat and careful in a way that told me she understood exactly what she was reading even before she reached the end of the sentence, and I remember the exact quality of the silence that followed it. Both of us sitting there, absorbing the fact that we had walked past that room. And in it, more times that summer than either of us could count, filing paperwork within a few feet of a drain that had been installed for exactly the purpose that logbook described. Neither of us went back into that particular room for the rest of the summer if we could help it. We started leaving that box of records for last each week, finding small, unspoken excuses to postpone it. And when we finally had no choice but to go in, near the very end of August, I remember standing in the doorway a full 10 seconds longer than necessary before forcing myself across the threshold, my eyes going immediately, involuntarily, to the corner where the floor sloped down toward that small, dark drain, half expecting to see something there that I would then have to spend the rest of the summer trying to unsee. I thought immediately, and without wanting to, of the young man behind the other door, and wondered, in a thought I have never fully been able to shake since, whether that room, the one with the drain, had been the last room of the house he had ever been carried through, whether he had passed across that same sloped stone floor on his way to somewhere else entirely, and whether some fragment of that final passage was what had made him so desperate, weeks later in my mind's eye, to keep the door of his own room sealed shut against two strangers who meant him no harm, but who he had no way of knowing that. I finished the internship. I filed the rest of the boxes, wrote the summary report my supervisor needed, and left that house at the end of August with a stronger academic understanding of institutional record-keeping than I had ever wanted, and a private, unshakable conviction that something in that basement corridor had been paying very close attention to me the entire time I was there, watching the way you watch someone handling things that used to matter to you and treating them as though they don't. I have not been back since, though the archive itself, I understand, is still being slowly worked through by whichever intern the university hires each summer, one box at a time, one locked door at a time. On my last day, packing up the folding table and the handful of personal items I'd accumulated over the summer, I made myself walk the length of that basement corridor one final time. Past every door we'd opened and cataloged and closed again, and I stopped, longer than I meant to, outside the one at the far end, the one that hadn't wanted to open. I don't know what I expected to happen. Nothing did. The corridor was silent the way it always was, cold in that same unplaceable way that had nothing to do with the season outside. And after a minute or two of standing there, I felt foolish enough to make myself keep walking, up the narrow stairs and out into the August heat, blinking against sunlight that felt, after a summer spent mostly underground, almost aggressive in its brightness. I looked up Patricia's story properly after that summer ended, once I finally had the nerve to search for more than the single clipping I'd stumbled across by accident. I found a fuller account eventually, written up by someone who had clearly spent years trying to piece together what had actually happened inside that house, and reading it confirmed almost everything the dream had already told me without my having asked. She had fought for her son for years. She had never stopped believing that the fear he described to her in his letters, the fear of being treated poorly, of being unseen, of being handled rather than helped, had everything to do with how he died. Nobody in any official capacity had ever agreed with her, not while she was alive to hear it and reading the account. I found myself thinking about how many letters like that must exist in archives like the one I had just spent a summer inside of. Boxes and boxes of people begging to be believed, filed neatly away and forgotten by everyone except, perhaps, the people they were written about. I think about her sometimes, more than I probably should, sitting across from me in that chair in the dream, screaming at me for treating her son's life as an afternoon's filing task. I understand now, in a way I didn't while I was living through that summer, that she wasn't entirely wrong to be angry. I had walked into that house, thinking of everything inside it as material, as history, as something safely finished and available for study. It took a locked door that wouldn't turn and a small slope drain in a stone floor to teach me that some of what happened inside that house had never actually finished happening at all, that it was still going on, quietly, patiently, in rooms that had simply been relabeled and reused, waiting for someone to walk close enough to notice. I still dream about her occasionally, less often now than that first summer, but never gone entirely. She doesn't scream anymore, not in the dreams I have now. She just sits across from me in that same narrow room, watching me with an expression I have never been able to fully read, somewhere between grief and warning, and she never says a single word. Sometimes, in those dreams, I notice that the chair beside her, the one that has always been empty before, has someone sitting in it now, a thin shape I can never quite bring into focus, no matter how directly I try to look at him, and each time I notice him there, my whole body goes cold in the dream, the same way it used to go cold, standing in that basement corridor, and each time. Before I can make myself look at him properly, I wake up. I always wake up before I find out what she's waiting for me to understand, and some nights I lie there afterward, staring at my own ceiling, absolutely certain that whatever it is, I already know. I took the job because the pay was good and the commute was short, and because I needed something steady after months of scraping by on part-time shifts at a pharmacy. The house sat at the end of a gravel road, a big white farmhouse that had been turned into a small private care home for elderly people who needed more help than their families could give, but didn't want the cold, fluorescent feeling of a hospital. There were only 6 residents living there at the time I started, each with their own bedroom upstairs and a staff of maybe 8 of us rotating through shifts. My mother had worked there for 13 years as the charge nurse, and it was through her that I got hired on as an aide. I want to say up front that I do not believe in ghosts. I want to say that, and I want you to know that I mean it, because everything I am about to tell you happened to a person who did not believe in ghosts, and by the end of it, I still don't know what I believe. The house itself was old, older than anyone working there could tell me for certain, though my mother guessed it had been built sometime in the early 1900s and added on to twice since then. You could tell where the additions were if you looked closely, because the floorboards changed color and the ceilings dipped slightly at the seams. The staircase in the front hall was original, dark wood, worn smooth in the middle of each step from 100 years of feet. There was a basement underneath the older part of the house that we used mostly for storage, and an attic above the second floor that nobody used at all, except to keep old furniture nobody wanted to throw away. I mention these details because they matter. In a hospital, you don't think about the architecture. In that house, the architecture was the first thing you noticed, and it never really let you forget it was there. My first few weeks were unremarkable. I learned the residents' names and their routines, learned which ones liked their coffee strong and which ones needed help remembering to take their pills, learned how to transfer someone from a wheelchair to a bed without hurting either of us. I liked the work more than I expected to. There is something quietly good about taking care of people at the end of their lives, even when it is hard, even when it smells like sickness and is dying itself in slow motion. I liked most of the residents. I liked the house, too, in the daytime. It had big windows and a wraparound porch, and in the mornings the light came through the kitchen in long gold bars that made even the ugliest linoleum look warm. The first strange thing happened on a Tuesday evening in October. I was walking one of our residents, a woman named Eleanor, who was sharp as a tack, despite being 91, toward the small sitting room at the end of the upstairs hallway where we sometimes let residents watch television before bed. The hallway upstairs was long and narrow, lined with doors on either side, and lit by a single overhead fixture that had always buzzed faintly, ever since I'd started. Eleanor stopped walking about halfway down the hall. She dug her fingers into my arm hard enough to leave a mark and said she wasn't going any further unless I turned the light off. I asked her why, thinking maybe the buzzing bothered her or the brightness hurt her eyes. She said, very calmly, the way you'd mentioned, that it looked like rain, that the little boy didn't like the light on when he was standing in it, and that if I didn't turn it off, he would get upset. I laughed, because I thought it was a joke, some dry bit of dementia humor, except Eleanor didn't have dementia, and she wasn't laughing. She was looking past my shoulder at a spot on the wall between two closed bedroom doors, and her face had the flat, exhausted look of someone repeating something they'd said 100 times before and were tired of not being believed. I turned the light off. She walked the rest of the way to the sitting room without another word. I told myself it was nothing. Old people say strange things. I'd heard worse working at the pharmacy. Customers convinced the government was reading their mail, convinced their neighbors were poisoning their water. This felt different, only in hindsight. At the time, I filed it away as an odd moment in an otherwise normal shift and went home and didn't think about it again until the following week. The second thing happened on a Thursday afternoon. I was walking past the room of a resident named Walter, a retired mechanic who had lost most of his mobility to a series of small strokes, but who still had all his wits about him. Still liked to talk your ear off about carburetors if you let him. His door was open, and as I passed, he called out to me, asked me to come in for a second. I stepped inside, expecting him to need help with something practical, his blanket readjusted, his water refilled. Instead, he asked me, in a tone so ordinary it took me a second to register the words, whether I had any candy on me. I told him I didn't, and asked why he wanted it. He said it wasn't for him. He said it was for the little boy who got sad when nobody had anything sweet to give him, and who Walter felt bad for because the boy was always so polite about asking. Never demanding, just hopeful, the way a kid is hopeful before they've learned that the answer is usually no. I asked Walter what little boy he meant. Walter looked at me like I'd asked him what color the sky was. He said the little boy who lived there, the one who was always around, especially in the evenings, especially near the stairs. I want to be honest and tell you that this second incident unsettled me more than it should have, precisely because it echoed the first one so closely, and because Walter and Eleanor did not know each other well, ate at different times, sat in different parts of the common room, and as far as I knew, had never had a real conversation. Two different residents, on two different days, describing the same presence in the same house, using almost the same language. I decided, that night after my shift ended, to ask my mother about it. We sat at her kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee, going cold between us, and I asked her, trying to sound casual, whether she'd ever heard anything strange from the residents about a little boy in the house. My mother did not laugh. She did not tell me I was being silly. She looked at me for a long moment, the way she used to look at me when I was a teenager and she was deciding how much of the truth I could handle, and then she told me that she had been waiting for someone to ask her that question for 13 years. She said that for as long as she had worked there, residents had reported seeing a young boy in the house. Not all residents, not even most, but enough, spread out across more than a decade, with no obvious pattern connecting them. No shared background, no shared decline in cognitive health that could explain it away as a symptom rather than a sighting. Some of the residents who reported him were perfectly lucid, people whose minds were as clear as anyone's. Some had advanced dementia and could barely remember their own children's names, and yet they described the boy with a consistency that unsettled even the doctors who came through on rounds. He was always described the same way. Dark hair, cut short and a little uneven, like it had been trimmed at home rather than by a barber. Thin, not sickly thin, my mother said, but thin the way boys were thin before anyone worried about that sort of thing. Thin from being outside all day instead of thin from not eating. He wanted to play. That detail came up again and again from residents who had never spoken to each other about it, who in some cases had never spoken to each other at all. He wanted someone to play with him, and he was disappointed, over and over, that nobody would. My mother told me something else that night that I have not been able to stop thinking about since. She said that the boy had, on more than one occasion, appeared to residents in more than one building. The house had changed ownership twice in her 13 years, and each time the new owners had eventually converted a different structure, moved residents to a different location while renovations were done. And each time, within a few weeks of the move, someone would mention the boy again, as if he had come with them, as if he were not attached to the house at all, but to something or someone that traveled between houses along with the residents. I asked her, half joking, half not, whether she believed it. She said that 13 years was a long time to keep hearing the same story from people who had never met each other and had nothing to gain from making it up, and that at some point, disbelief starts to feel less like skepticism and more like willful blindness. She said one more thing before we changed the subject, something that has stuck with me the way certain sentences do. Lodging themselves somewhere behind your ribs and staying there. She said the boy seemed to be especially drawn to residents who had lost their sight or were losing it. That he appeared to the blind and the nearly blind far more often and far more vividly than he did to anyone else. Nobody on staff had ever figured out why. I didn't sleep well that night. I lay in bed running through every resident I could think of who had vision problems, counting them off like a grim little inventory and telling myself it didn't matter, that none of it was real, that old people misremember and misperceive, and the mind does strange things at the end of a long life. I almost believed myself. Almost, somewhere around 2 a.m, I got up for a glass of water, and on my way back to bed, I stopped in my own hallway and stood there for a long moment, listening to the ordinary sounds of my apartment settling around me. I realized I had started counting the seconds between one small creak and the next, waiting to see if a second sound would answer the first. The way you listen when you are trying to work out whether a noise came from a person or from a house. Nothing answered. I told myself that was proof of nothing, that fear invents its own evidence out of silence, and I went back to bed and lay very still until the window outside had turned from black to gray. The next few days at work, I found myself watching the residents differently, paying attention in a way I hadn't before. I noticed things I had somehow not noticed in my first weeks there. I noticed that the 2 residents with the worst eyesight, an elderly man named Dennis, who had macular degeneration, and a woman down the hall named Ruth, who had gone almost completely blind from untreated glaucoma years before she ever arrived at the house. Both had a habit of turning their heads toward the same corner of the upstairs hallway whenever they were wheeled past it, the way you turn toward a sound rather than toward nothing. I told myself it meant nothing. Blind people orient toward sound and toward drafts of air all the time. It didn't have to mean what some small, cold part of my chest was starting to suspect it meant. 2 weeks passed without incident, and I started to relax again, the way you do when fear doesn't get fed. I went back to my routine. I fed residents their meals, helped with baths, changed dressings, laughed at Walter's carburetor stories, even though I didn't understand half of what he was saying. The house, in daylight, was still just a house, warm and a little creaky and smelling faintly of antiseptic and old wood. It was easy during the day to believe my mother had been exaggerating, or that 13 years of institutional memory had calcified into something closer to folklore than fact. Then came the resident I need to tell you about specifically, because she is the reason I am writing this at all. Her name was Marion. She had come to the house about 4 months before I started working there, following a stroke that had taken most of the strength on her right side and left her almost entirely blind in both eyes. A complication nobody had fully explained to me. Something about the stroke affecting the part of her brain that processed vision rather than her eyes themselves. She could make out light and shadow, movement and bright conditions, but nothing else. No faces, no shapes, nothing you or I would call sight. She required total assistance with eating, since her right hand was useless, and her left hand shook too badly to manage a spoon with any reliability. Feeding her was part of my regular rotation, usually in the evening in her room, with the door half open and the hallway light spilling in. Marion was, by every account, one of the sweetest residents in the house. She never complained, never grew frustrated with her own body the way some of the others did, and she talked constantly while I fed her, stories about her childhood, about a husband who had died 20 years earlier, about a garden she used to keep before her hands stopped cooperating. I looked forward to her shifts more than almost anyone else's. I want you to understand that I liked her. I want you to understand that what I'm about to describe happened to someone I cared about, not a stranger, not an abstraction. It was a Wednesday evening, late October, close enough to the first frost that the house had started making the particular groaning, settling sounds old houses make when the temperature drops fast after sunset. I remember it was raining lightly outside, a thin, cold rain that hissed against the window and made the whole room feel closed in, private, the way rain does. I had brought Marion's dinner tray up and was sitting beside her bed, spoon in hand, working through a bowl of soup that had probably gone lukewarm by the time I got to it. The hallway light was on behind me, and the door was open about a foot, the way it always was, because Marion liked to hear the sounds of the house even though she couldn't see it, said it made her feel less alone. I remember the room got cold. Not gradually, the way rooms cool when a draft comes through a window, but suddenly, in the space of maybe 10 or 15 seconds, the kind of cold that makes the hair on your arms stand up before your mind has even registered why. I assumed a door had opened somewhere downstairs, that the heating had cycled off. Something mundane. I kept spooning soup into Marion's mouth, and she kept talking. Something about her garden, about tomatoes that had done well one particular summer decades ago, and I was only half listening, the way you do with a story you've heard pieces of before. And then I felt a hand close around my forearm. It was not Marion's hand. Marion's right hand was limp in her lap, curled uselessly, the way it always was, and her left hand was resting on the blanket, holding nothing. The hand on my arm was small, a child's hand, or close enough to one that my body understood it before my mind did. And it was cold, in a way that skin should not be cold. Cold like something that had been sitting in a freezer. Cold that seemed to come from underneath the skin rather than off the surface of it. Cold that I felt travel up through my own arm like water finding a crack. I did not move. I could not move. Every part of my body had gone rigid, and my breath had caught somewhere high in my chest, and I remember the smell that came with it, faint and strange, like wet earth and something green, something like sap or crushed pine needles, the smell of being outside in the woods after rain, completely out of place in a warm upstairs bedroom in October. Marion stopped talking about her tomatoes mid-sentence. Her blind eyes, which never focused on anything, seemed for just a moment to fix on a point, just past my shoulder, in the direction the cold seemed to be radiating from, and her face changed. Not into fear, which is what I would have expected and what my own face must have looked like, into something closer to fond amusement, the exact expression a grandmother gets when she catches her grandson doing something a little bit naughty. And she said, in a voice light with teasing, "Is that your boyfriend? He looks a little young for you." I did not answer her. I don't think I was capable of answering her. The cold hand stayed on my arm for what felt like a very long time, but was probably only a few seconds. And then it was gone, all at once, the way it had come. And the room's temperature came back up so fast, I felt sweat break out along my hairline almost immediately, my body overcorrecting for a threat that had already passed. The smell of pine and wet earth lingered another moment, and then faded too. Marion, apparently satisfied with her joke, went back to talking about her garden as if nothing had happened at all, as if she had not just described, casually, warmly, the exact thing I had felt but could not see. I finished feeding her because I did not know what else to do, because my training and my instincts told me to finish the task in front of me, even while every other part of me wanted to run out of that room and down the stairs and out the front door into the cold rain. I said goodnight to her. I told her to sleep well. She smiled at me with her unfocused eyes and told me to say hello to my young friend for her next time, and laughed, a small, dry laugh, and I left the room and stood in the hallway for a full minute with my back against the wall, trying to get my breathing back under control, staring down the length of that narrow corridor toward the stairs, toward the closed door of the attic access at the far end, feeling watched in a way I had never felt in that house before. Not even after everything Eleanor and Walter and my mother had told me. I did not sleep that night either. I lay awake, replaying the cold, the smell, the small hand closing around my arm, with a grip that had been gentle, almost tentative, the way a child grips something he isn't sure he's allowed to touch. I thought about what my mother had said, about the boy being drawn to residents who had lost their sight, and I thought about Marion's blind eyes fixing on a spot just past my shoulder, as if she could somehow still see him there, better than any of us with working eyes ever could. I was not scheduled to work again until Friday. When I came in for my shift, the house had a different feeling to it immediately, the kind of hushed, careful quiet that settles over a place after something has happened, even before anyone tells you what. My mother met me at the door instead of letting me clock in normally, which she never did, and she told me, gently, the way you tell someone news you know is going to hurt, that Marion had passed away in her sleep sometime during the night after I'd fed her. No struggle, no distress. The overnight aide had found her peacefully in her bed the next morning, already gone, her face relaxed, almost smiling. A quiet death, the kind everyone hopes for, the kind you're supposed to be grateful for on behalf of someone you cared about. I have tried, in the time since, to feel grateful. I have tried to tell myself that Marion went peacefully, in her sleep, without pain, and that whatever I felt in that room that night was nothing more than an old house settling, a draft finding its way through a gap in an old window frame, a smell drifting up from wet leaves outside, my own mind playing tricks on me after weeks of unsettling stories from residents whose minds weren't entirely reliable to begin with. I have tried very hard to believe that. But I still work in that house. I still walk that upstairs hallway most evenings, past the door of the room that used to be Marion's and now belongs to someone else, someone who has not, as far as I know, mentioned anything strange yet. And some nights, when the light in the hallway is buzzing and the house has gone quiet the way it does after the last resident settles in for the evening, I find myself pausing at that same spot on the wall between two doors, the spot Eleanor once refused to walk past. And I find myself, without meaning to, without wanting to, checking the temperature of the air against my own skin before I take another step. 2 nights ago, walking past that same stretch of hallway with a stack of clean linens in my arms, I felt the air go cold around my wrists, just my wrists, just for a moment, gone before I could even be sure it had happened at all. I did not stop walking. I did not look behind me. I have started, without deciding to, leaving a small hard candy on the little table outside that room every evening before I go home, The way you'd leave something out for a stray animal you don't want to feed, but also can't bring yourself to turn away. My mother noticed it about a week in. She didn't say anything the first time, just looked at the little wrapped candy sitting there on the table, and then looked at me. And something passed between us that neither of us put into words. The second week, she added one of her own beside mine, a peppermint from the jar she keeps at the nurse's station, set down without comment, as if it were simply part of the closing routine now, like checking the thermostat or locking the medication cabinet. Neither of us has ever spoken about it directly. I think we are both afraid that naming it out loud will make it more real than either of us can afford for it to be, and so we do it in silence. 2 candies on a little table outside a door that used to belong to someone kind. And we go home, and we come back the next evening, and the candies are always gone. I have asked myself more than once whether that means anything, whether an empty wrapper table proves a single thing beyond the ordinary fact that housekeeping tidies the hallway before the morning shift arrives. I have never once asked housekeeping directly. There is a version of the truth I am not sure I want confirmed, and a version of comfort that only survives as long as the question stays unasked. And most nights now, I choose the second one, because it lets me sleep, and because some part of me has started to believe that whatever walks that hallway after the lights go down is not, in the end, unkind, only lonely. Only waiting, the way children wait, for someone to finally say yes. The new resident in Marion's old room has been there almost a month now. She has good eyesight, sharp as a hawk's, reads the newspaper every morning without her glasses, and so far she has said nothing about a boy, nothing about candy, nothing about anyone standing at the foot of her bed in the evenings. I check on her every night before I leave, the way I check on all of them, and every night I find myself lingering a few seconds longer at her doorway than I do at any of the others, waiting to see if her face will change the way Eleanor's did, the way Walter's did, the way Marion's did at the very end, into that same soft, terrible recognition of something the rest of us are not meant to see. She hasn't said anything yet, but she is going blind. The doctors gave her 18 months, maybe 2 years, before the cataracts take what little central vision she has left. And I've started counting down the calendar in my head the way you count down to a date you are dreading and cannot stop, because some quiet, certain part of me already knows exactly what is coming for her, and exactly when it will arrive, and there is nothing in any training I have ever received that tells me how a person is supposed to prepare someone for that. My mother will not watch a movie with a possession in it. She will sit through almost anything else. Slashers, haunted asylums, cursed dolls. She can handle all of it with a bowl of popcorn in her lap and barely a flinch. But the moment a film so much as hints at something wearing a person from the inside, she gets up and leaves the room, and she does not come back until the credits are rolling. For most of my life, I thought this was just a preference, the way some people can't watch anything involving needles or heights. It wasn't until I was in my 20s that I finally asked her why, directly, and got the whole story, sitting at her kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon with the light going gold through the window the way it does late in the day. She told it to me once, all the way through, and then she told me she would never tell it again, and as far as I know, she never has. I'm going to try to tell it the way she told it to me, and I want you to know that my mother is not a woman prone to exaggeration. She is practical. She balances her checkbook by hand. She does not believe in luck, and she believes every word of what I am about to write down. She was 15, and it was a Friday night in early autumn, cold enough that the windows were fogging up, but not yet cold enough for snow. She'd been invited to a sleepover at her friend Carol's house, one of those big old two-story houses on the edge of town that had been in Carol's family for 2 generations. The kind of house with a wraparound porch and a root cellar underneath the kitchen and a second staircase in the back that nobody used except to carry laundry down to the basement. There were 4 girls at the sleepover total. My mother, Carol, and 2 other friends whose names have blurred together over the decades, but whose faces, she says, she still remembers clearly, especially from that night. Carol's parents were downstairs in the den at the front of the house, half watching television, half dozing. The way parents do when they've decided a sleepover means their evening is basically over anyway. The 4 girls were upstairs at first, but around 9 they came down to the living room, the big open room at the back of the house with the fireplace and the old couch and the television set against the far wall, because Carol wanted to show them something she'd found in the hall closet earlier that week while looking for extra blankets. It was a board, flat and dark varnished, with letters and numbers printed across it in an old-fashioned Gothic type, the word yes in one corner and the word no in the other, and a heart-shaped piece of wood with a little window cut into the center of it. My mother had never seen anything like it before. She grew up in a house where board games meant Monopoly and Sorry and this thing. Whatever it was looked older than any toy she owned, its varnish worn thin along the edges where dozens of fingers must have rested over the years before it ended up forgotten in the back of a closet. Carol explained, half giggling, that it was a talking board, that you put your fingers on the little heart-shaped piece and asked it questions, and it answered you, spelled things out letter by letter. My mother says she remembers thinking it sounded like nonsense, a party trick, the kind of thing that worked because someone was secretly pushing it around the board on purpose. She sat down on the living room floor with the other 3 girls anyway, because it was a Friday night and she was 15, and nothing sounded more fun in that moment than nonsense. They turned off most of the lamps, left the television on low in the background for company, more light than sound, and set the board on the floor between them, their knees almost touching, fingertips resting light as breath on the wooden piece. Carol's parents were still in the den at the front of the house, close enough that my mother could hear the murmur of the evening news through the wall, which she says made her feel safe, made the whole thing feel silly and harmless. 4 girls playing pretend in a house full of adults, just a room away. At first, nothing happened, or nothing that felt like anything. The piece sat still under their fingers, and they asked it foolish questions, whether Carol's crush from school liked her back, whether any of them would grow up to be famous. And the piece drifted lazily in small circles that never seemed to land anywhere meaningful, more like 4 sets of nervous fingers unconsciously pushing against each other than anything with intention behind it. My mother says she was starting to get bored, starting to think about asking if they could put the thing away and watch a movie instead, when one of the other girls, not Carol, asked a different kind of question. She asked if there was anyone there with them, someone in the house, something in the room. The piece moved. It didn't drift the way it had before, lazy and uncertain. It moved with what my mother describes as purpose, gliding smoothly to the word yes in the corner of the board and stopping there, dead still, the way a car stops when you hit the brake, rather than when you simply let it roll to a halt. My mother says that was the first moment the fun feeling started to curdle into something else. A small, cold seed of wrongness planted low in her stomach, though she couldn't have told you why. They all looked at each other. Someone laughed, too loud. The kind of laugh people make specifically to convince themselves and everyone around them that nothing is wrong. They should have stopped there. My mother has said that to me more than once in the years since, always with the same weary certainty. We should have stopped right there and put it back in the closet and gone upstairs and gone to sleep. Instead, someone, she still isn't sure which of them, asked the board to show itself. Show us you're really here. My mother remembers the exact wording because it is replayed in her mind more times than she can count in the 50 years since. For a moment, nothing happened. And then every light in the house went out at once. Not just the lamps in the living room. Every light in every room, all through the house, including the television, which didn't fade or flicker the way a television does when the power browns out, but simply cut to black and silence in the same instant, as though someone had thrown a single switch that controlled the entire building. My mother says the dark that followed was the kind of dark you don't get in a house with electricity, total and absolute, thick enough that she couldn't see her own hand in front of her face. And in that dark, she heard Carol's mother's voice from the den at the front of the house, sharp with surprise, saying something like, "What on earth?" And Carol's father's voice under it, low and confused, both of them clearly as caught off guard as the girls were. And then, just as suddenly as it had gone, the power came back. Every light snapped back on at once. The television resumed mid-sentence from whatever program had been playing, and the four girls sat there on the living room floor, blinking against the sudden brightness, staring at each other and at the board between them, hearts pounding, nobody quite ready to be the first to speak. My mother says her first instinct, the instinct she clung to hardest, was that it had to be a fluke, a blown fuse and a breaker resetting itself. Something with a boring electrical explanation that had nothing to do with the board sitting in front of them. She wanted very badly to believe that. She has told me since that wanting to believe something and actually believing it turned out, that night, to be two very different things. They kept playing. My mother says she has never been able to fully explain, even to herself, why they didn't stop. Why four frightened 15-year-old girls chose to put their fingers back on that piece of wood instead of throwing it in the trash right then. She thinks it was some combination of pride, none of them wanting to be the one who admitted she was scared, and a horrible kind of curiosity, the sense that they had started something and needed to see where it went. Someone asked the question that my mother says she now believes was the true mistake of the evening, the one that opened whatever door needed opening. "Who are you?" The piece began to move in wide, deliberate circles, faster than before, dragging their fingertips along with it in loops around the board that felt less like four girls guiding it together, and more like all four of them being pulled along by something with a single unified will. It slowed and stopped at the letter D. Then it moved again, smooth and certain, no hesitation, no drifting, straight to E, then V, then I. Then, at last, it stopped on L and sat there, unmoving, while all four girls stared down at the word it had spelled and felt, my mother says, the particular kind of fear that doesn't have anywhere to go. Fear with no direction to run in, because the thing frightening you is sitting right there under your own fingers. Someone, and my mother swears to this day it wasn't her. Though she also admits none of them ever agreed afterward on whose voice it was, said, out loud, into the room, "If you're really the devil, then show yourself." My mother has told me that she does not know what possessed her friend to say those words, that even at 15, some small animal part of her brain understood you were not supposed to invite something like that to prove itself, that the not knowing was supposed to stay the not knowing, safer that way. But the words were already out, hanging in the warm living room air, and there was no taking them back. Nothing happened right away. The four of them sat frozen, fingers still resting on the piece, waiting, the seconds stretching out long and elastic the way they do when your whole body is braced for something. And then the television, which had been playing quietly in the background the entire time, went dark. Not the whole house this time, Just the screen, blinking off into a smooth black mirror in the middle of the far wall, reflecting the dim living room back at them. The lamp in the corner, the fireplace, the four of them sitting cross-legged on the floor, and something else. My mother says that in the reflection of that dead television screen, in the space just behind them and slightly to the side, near the doorway that led back toward the front hall, there was a shape. Not a person. She has never been able to describe it as a person, has never used the word man or woman or figure the way you would for something with a recognizable shape. She describes it only as tall, taller than the doorway should have allowed for, and dark in a way that seemed to swallow the lamp light around it rather than simply block it. A wrongness of shadow that had a kind of density to it. A weight sitting there in the reflection as calmly as if it had always belonged in that room. She says Carol's parents saw it too. Carol's mother had come to the doorway of the den by then, drawn by the girl's earlier scream when the lights first went out, and she saw the same reflection in the dead screen that the girls did, and she made a sound my mother has never forgotten. A sharp, strangled intake of breath, followed by absolute silence. The sound of a grown woman losing, all at once, whatever certainty she'd walked into that room with. The temperature in the house dropped so fast, my mother remembers her breath beginning to show. Actual visible clouds of it in the living room air, in a house that had been warm enough for shorts and t-shirts 20 minutes before. And then the noise started, not in the living room, but through the wall, from the kitchen. Loud and violent and immediate. The sound of the refrigerator door slamming, of something heavy hitting the floor, of the cupboard doors above the counter banging open and shut in rapid, rhythmic succession, like something was working its way down the row of them, one by one, testing each one, furious that none of them held what it was looking for. That was when the game ended. My mother says nobody discussed it. Nobody voted. The four of them simply scrambled up off the floor at the same moment. Carol grabbing the board and the little wooden piece with hands that were shaking so badly she nearly dropped them twice. And they ran, all of them, straight through the kitchen where the cupboard doors were still slamming, past Carol's father, who had come running from the den white-faced and useless with shock, and out the back door into the cold night air where they stood on the porch steps in their socks, shivering, listening to the house behind them finally, gradually go quiet again. Carol threw the board and the piece straight into the metal trash can beside the garage that night, didn't even wait for morning. Wanted it out of the house immediately, out of arm's reach, out of sight. My mother says none of them ever discussed getting it back. Never even joked about it the way teenagers usually turn frightening things into stories to laugh about later. It went in the trash and stayed there, and the next week when the garbage truck came, my mother watched it get lifted into the back of the truck and crushed with something that felt, she says, less like relief than like watching a door close on something that was still, somehow, on the other side of it. The lights came back on properly after a while, though Carol's father spent that whole night and most of the next morning checking every breaker in the box in the basement, and never found anything wrong with a single one of them. The girls went back inside eventually, because it was cold and they had nowhere else to go, and they slept, or tried to. All four of them crammed into Carol's bedroom upstairs with every lamp in the room left burning, nobody willing to suggest turning even one of them off. My mother did fall asleep eventually, exhausted past the point where fear could keep her awake any longer, and she doesn't know how much time passed before something woke her. She remembers it was still full dark outside, no gray edge of morning yet at the curtains, and the first thing she was aware of was sound, coming from directly above her, from the roof of the house. It was rhythmic, heavy, a dragging, clanking sound, metal against shingle, the unmistakable sound of chains being pulled across a roof, and underneath it, weaving through it, something that made the small hairs on the back of my mother's neck stand up before her waking mind had even fully processed what she was hearing. Dogs, not barking exactly, but a low, guttural panting, several sets of it, moving in time with the dragging chains, back and forth across the roof above her head, as though something large were pacing up there, patrolling, testing the edges of the house the way an animal tests the boundaries of a pen. She lay frozen in the dark, staring up at the ceiling, telling herself, the same way she'd told herself about the lights earlier, that it had to be something ordinary. A raccoon, maybe, though the sound was far too large and far too coordinated for that, too deliberate, too heavy for anything with 4 small paws. A branch scraping in the wind, though there was no wind that night, the air outside dead calm, and branches don't clank like chains, don't pant the way a living thing pants when it's working hard, or hungry, or excited about something it has finally cornered. She thought absurdly about waking Carol, about reaching across the dark room to shake her friend's shoulder and ask if she heard it too. But some instinct held her still instead, some deep animal certainty that moving, making noise, drawing attention to herself in that room, was exactly the wrong thing to do while whatever was up there kept pacing back and forth above her head. She lay there for what felt like an hour, though she has no real way of knowing how long it actually was, listening to that slow, deliberate pacing overhead, until eventually, mercifully, exhaustion overtook fear, and she slept again, and did not wake until morning light was coming properly through the curtains. At breakfast the next day, shaky and hollow-eyed, none of the girls having slept well, my mother worked up the nerve to ask Carol's mother, carefully, whether any of the neighbors kept dogs. Carol's mother, who looked as though she herself had not slept at all, went very still at the question, and then told my mother, quietly, that no, none of the neighbors on that street had ever had dogs, not in all the years they'd lived there. And then, before my mother could decide whether to say anything more, Carol's mother added, without being asked, that she and her husband had heard it too. The chains, the panting, moving across the roof above their own bedroom for what felt like most of the night, stopping only once the first gray light of dawn had started to show. Nobody in that house ever spoke of it again, not directly, not in any detail. My mother went home the next day and told her own parents only a vague, sanitized version, a scary story at a sleepover, nothing more, because she didn't know how to explain the rest of it in a way that wouldn't sound insane. And some deep instinct told her that saying certain things out loud again, giving them shape a second time with her own voice, was not something she wanted to do. She never played with a board like that again. She has, in the decades since, refused every single time one has been offered to her. At parties, at other people's houses, once even by me, years ago, half joking, not understanding yet what I was asking. She reacted, that time with a fury that startled me, real fear behind the anger, and made me swear on the spot that I would never bring one into her house again. Not as a gift, not as a joke, not ever. She stayed friends with Carol for a few more years after that, through the rest of high school. But she told me they never once went back to that living room together after dark. Not for movie nights, not for study sessions, nothing. If they had homework to do, they did it at my mother's house instead, or at the library. And if Carol ever noticed the pattern, she never said anything about it. As though some unspoken agreement between the two of them had settled the matter permanently, without either of them needing to put it into words. My mother heard, years later, long after she'd married and moved away and lost touch with most of the people from that town, that Carol's family had eventually sold the house and moved out of state. She doesn't know the reason. She has never asked. And some part of her, she admits, doesn't want to know. Because there is a version of the answer she has already imagined for herself in the years since. And she would rather live with the version she imagined than find out she was right. She still won't watch a film with an exorcism in it. She still won't watch anything where a character speaks with more than one voice, or moves in a way a body isn't supposed to move, or stares at a mirror too long. She has told me this story exactly once, all the way through, sitting across from me at her kitchen table, with the light going gold and then gray as the afternoon wore on, and when she finished, she told me, very plainly, that she believed then and believes now that whatever answered them that night in Carol's living room was exactly what it claimed to be, and that it had sat with them, close enough to reach out and touch for the better part of an hour, patient and curious and in no hurry at all, the way something sits with you when it already knows it has all the time in the world. She asked me, after she finished telling it, never to bring it up again, and I haven't, not once, not in all the years since. What she didn't ask me, and what I have never told her, is that I have my own small ritual now, too, one I've never explained to anyone, born entirely out of that one telling at her kitchen table. Every house I've ever lived in since hearing that story, I've made a point, quietly, without ceremony, of learning the sound the roof makes on an ordinary windy night, the particular creak and settle of it, so that I would know, immediately and without doubt, the difference between that sound and something else. I tell myself this is just carefulness, the same practical instinct my mother has always had, nothing more than knowing your own house well enough to notice when it's wrong. I don't examine the thought much further than that, because I suspect if I did, I would find something underneath it that looks a great deal like fear. I think about my mother at 15 more than I probably should, sitting cross-legged on a stranger's living room floor with her fingertips resting on a piece of wood she'd never seen before that night, asking questions she didn't understand the weight of in a house that seemed, for 1 hour, to belong to something else entirely. I think about the four of them running barefoot through a cold kitchen while the cupboards slammed themselves open and shut around them, and about a grown woman standing frozen in a doorway, watching something take shape in a dead television screen, watching her own certainty about the world come apart in real time. And I think most of all about the chains on the roof, moving back and forth in the dark above four sleeping teenagers, patient, unhurried, in absolutely no rush at all. The way something moves when it already knows exactly how the night is going to end, and knows it has all the time in the world to get there. But sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet and I happen to hear something shift or settle on the roof above me, wind against shingles, a branch, a possum, nothing, I find myself lying very still in the dark, listening for a second sound underneath the first. And I don't move again until I'm sure, absolutely sure, that it hasn't come. The school I went to for 3 years was not originally built to be a school. It had started life, more than a century earlier, as a private mansion, the kind of sprawling Gilded Age estate built by a family who made their money in railroads or steel or something equally forgettable now, its stone facade and tall arched windows still hinting, even after every renovation the district had piled on top of it, at a grandeur nobody had quite managed to erase. Somewhere along the way, after the family died out or moved on or ran out of money, it had been converted into a private academy. Its ballroom turned into an auditorium. Its servants' quarters turned into faculty offices. Its wine cellar turned into storage that nobody particularly liked going down into. Almost every staff member who worked there for more than a year or two had a story to tell if you asked them the right way. I don't mean that a few teachers had a story and the rest humored them. I mean that if you sat down with any given teacher, any janitor, any long-tenured administrator, and asked them directly whether anything strange had ever happened to them in that building, the overwhelming majority of them would go quiet for a moment, glance around as if checking who else might be listening, and then tell you something, usually in a lowered voice, as though the walls themselves might be paying attention. More than one teacher flatly refused to be in the building alone after dark would find any excuse, real or invented, to leave before the last of the daylight faded from the tall old windows, watching the sky outside more closely than their own clocks toward the end of the day. I want to tell you a handful of the stories I collected over my time there. Some from teachers who told them to entire classrooms, like well-worn party pieces, and some from people who only told them once, quietly, glancing at the door as they spoke, and never brought them up again. The first story I ever heard came from a history teacher, an older man who had taught at the school for close to 20 years and had, by his own admission, stopped being frightened of most of what happened in that building a long time ago. The way you stop being frightened of a familiar dog even after it's growled at you a few times. He was in the building alone one evening, working late in his classroom on the second floor, somewhere around 9:30, grading papers with the kind of single-minded focus that makes you forget, for a while, how quiet a large building actually is once everyone else has gone home, how different the same familiar hallway sounds once there's no chatter of students left to fill it. He told us he heard a door slam somewhere down the hall, sharp and sudden enough that it made him jump in his seat. And his first thought, he said, was that it was another staff member, maybe a janitor, doing rounds. Maybe a colleague messing with him the way teachers sometimes do when they know someone's still in the building and want to give them a scare. He got up, walked to his classroom doorway, and looked out into the hall, his own pulse loud in his ears. It was empty. Every door along that stretch of corridor was closed, still, exactly as he remembered leaving them earlier that evening. And there was no sign of another person anywhere. No footsteps receding around a corner, no light spilling from under a door that hadn't been lit a moment before. The hallway itself, he said, had that particular quality old buildings get once the daylight is fully gone, the overhead fixtures buzzing faintly, throwing a flat yellow light that didn't quite reach into the corners near the ceiling, where the old crown molding, left over from the mansion's original life, cast thin bands of shadow along the walls. He told us he stood there for a few seconds, waiting for someone to pop out laughing, waiting for the prank to reveal itself the way pranks usually do once the target has been sufficiently startled. Nothing happened. He decided to walk the length of the hallway anyway, partly out of stubbornness, partly because some part of him needed to prove to himself that there was a rational explanation waiting just around the next corner. Footsteps loud in his own ears against the silence that felt heavier than any silence in that building had felt to him before. He hadn't gone more than a few doors down when he heard another slam, closer this time, coming from a small side room used for janitorial supplies. A room built entirely of old, exposed brick with no windows and, as far as he knew, no possible way in or out, except the single door he was now standing in front of. He said his hand hesitated on the handle longer than he'd like to admit before he finally turned it and pulled the door open. The room was empty. Mops leaning against the brick wall exactly where they always leaned, buckets stacked in the corner. Nowhere for a single living person to hide. Not so much as a gap behind a shelf large enough to conceal anyone. He said the air in that closet felt colder than the hallway outside it, colder than made sense for a small interior room with no windows and no direct exposure to the night air, and that the cold seemed to press against him the longer he stood in the doorway, as though the room itself were holding its breath, waiting to see what he would do next. He told us, with a kind of flat, tired honesty that made the story land harder than if he'd played it up for drama, that he didn't investigate any further after that. He went back to his classroom, gathered his things with hands that weren't entirely steady, turned off the lights without bothering to finish the stack of papers still waiting on his desk, and left the building faster than he had left it in years, and that as far as he knew, he had never again stayed past dark in that building alone if he could possibly help it, always finding some reason, real or invented, to have his grading finished and his bag packed well before the sun went down. The auditorium, the old converted ballroom on the ground floor, was widely agreed to be the worst room in the building, the one place almost everyone with a story eventually circled back to, whether or not their particular experience had happened there directly. It had a raised stage at one end, built decades after the original ballroom floor had been laid, and beneath that stage ran a narrow crawl space accessible through a trapdoor cut into the boards, the kind of space every school with an old auditorium seems to have, used for storing props and set pieces that didn't fit anywhere else, sealed shut with a heavy iron padlock whenever it wasn't actively in use. The teacher who ran our school's Deca Club, a business and marketing organization, had a habit every year of taking his students on what he called ghost hunts, informal after-hours explorations of the building armed with nothing more than flashlights and a healthy appetite for being scared. He told this particular story to our club during my second year, and I remember exactly how the room went silent while he told it, the usual restless chatter of a dozen teenagers dying away almost immediately once he started talking. They had just gotten back from an out-of-town competition, he said, tired, wired on gas station coffee, and the particular adrenaline that comes from a long drive. And someone had suggested, half joking, that they do an impromptu hunt before everyone went home for the night. It was around 10 o'clock, the parking lot outside, nearly empty except for the 2 cars they'd driven back in, the whole building dark except for the small pool of light near the side entrance they used to let themselves in. He remembered the walk from that door to the auditorium more vividly than almost anything else about that night, he said. The way their footsteps echoed differently once they left the tiled front hallway and moved into the older part of the building, the original wood floors underneath creaking in places that felt almost deliberate, spaced out like something testing its own weight rather than simple settling. They made their way into the auditorium, flashlights cutting narrow beams through a darkness that felt, he said, thicker in that room than it had any right to feel, thick in a way that seemed to swallow the light rather than simply resist it, so that even with several flashlights sweeping the space, the far corners of the room stayed stubbornly, unnaturally black. They had barely settled into the space, still laughing, still loose with the last of the day's energy, still riding the particular giddiness that comes from being somewhere you're not technically supposed to be after hours, when a crash rang out from the direction of the stage. He described it as a clattering, chaotic sound, several things falling at once rather than one, the particular hollow clatter of wood striking wood in quick succession, and it took him a second in the darkness to place it. Every student in that room going rigid at the same instant, flashlight beams swinging wildly toward the stage before anyone consciously decided to move them. Once the lights came back on, seconds later, hands scrambling for the switches along the wall, they found a small collection of prop spears, decorative wooden shafts used in some past production, scattered across the stage floor as though they'd been knocked from wherever they'd been leaning all at once, several of them still faintly rocking where they'd landed, coming to rest one by one in a silence that felt, he said, louder than the crash itself had been. Nobody was there. The stage was empty. The wings on either side were empty, And when a few of the braver students went to check the trapdoor beneath the stage, certain that someone must have crawled up from underneath and knocked the props over on their way through, they found the padlock still fastened tight from the top side, exactly where it always sat, undisturbed. The metal cold under their fingers in a way that made at least one of them let go of it faster than they needed to. He remembered standing there afterward, all of them clustered near the center of the auditorium under the full glare of the overhead lights. Nobody willing to be the first to suggest they keep exploring. Nobody willing either to be the one who suggested leaving. As though admitting fear out loud would somehow make whatever had knocked those spears over take a more direct interest in them. It was one of the younger students, he said, a freshman who'd only joined the club a few weeks earlier, who finally broke the silence by asking, in a very small voice, whether they could please go home now. And nobody argued with her. They left the auditorium that night faster than they'd entered it, he told us, and none of them brought up going back in until enough time had passed for the fear to fade into something closer to a story worth telling rather than a memory worth avoiding. That same year, he said, they went back into the auditorium a second time, weeks later, telling themselves the first incident had been a fluke, a prop shelf finally giving way under its own age, nothing more, the kind of story that gets less frightening the more times you retell it in daylight. They were standing near the center of the room when they heard another crash, this one distinct enough that everyone immediately turned toward it, a metal bucket hitting the floor with a hollow, ringing clatter that echoed oddly off the high ceiling, a sound that seemed to bounce back at them from several directions at once before finally settling into silence. The strange part, he told us, wasn't just that the bucket had fallen. It was where it landed. The bucket had been sitting on a shelf on one side of the auditorium, near the wings by the stage, and it ended up on the floor on the completely opposite side of the room, near the doors they'd come in through, a distance that made no sense for something simply toppling off a shelf under its own weight, the kind of distance you'd expect only if the bucket had been picked up and thrown, deliberately, with some force behind it, across a space wide enough that he found himself, even years later telling the story, unable to fully explain how it could have happened by accident. Nobody was close enough to have done it themselves, and none of the flashlight beams sweeping the room in the seconds immediately after caught so much as a shadow moving away from where the bucket must have started its flight. They left again, quickly, the way you leave a room once you've decided you'd rather explain the mystery later from a safer distance than keep standing inside it while it's still unfolding. The last story he told us that year, and the one that has stayed with me longest, involved a single old wooden chair that had been sitting in the auditorium for as long as anyone could remember. Part of a mismatched set left over from some production decades earlier, never fully cleared out because nobody could be bothered to figure out where it was supposed to go, pushed off to one side near the base of the stage where it had accumulated a fine layer of dust that nobody ever seemed to disturb except, apparently, by accident. He told us he'd sat in that chair himself during one of their hunts, taking a break partway through, resting for a few minutes, while his students explored the rest of the room with their flashlights, the old wood creaking faintly under his weight, the way old furniture does, settling into a shape that had clearly been sat in many times before by many other people over many other years. When he was finished, he stood up and walked away, back toward the group, and didn't think about the chair again until they were all leaving the auditorium a short while later, filing out toward the main doors, flashlights sweeping ahead of them, the tension of the evening finally starting to ease now that the exit was in sight. Something made him glance back over his shoulder as he reached the doorway. He said he couldn't explain afterward exactly what prompted the glance, some small itch at the back of his neck, the kind of feeling you get when you sense you're being watched by someone standing directly behind you. A feeling he'd learned over the years working in that building not to simply ignore. When he looked, the chair he had been sitting in was rocking, gently, back and forth, the way a chair rocks in the seconds right after someone has stood up from it, and the momentum hasn't fully settled yet. A small, steady motion visible even from the doorway, even in the beam of a single flashlight pointed toward it from across the room. The problem, he told us, his voice going quieter as he got to this part, was that he had gotten out of that chair a full 30 seconds earlier, easily enough time for any residual movement to have died out completely, and nobody had gone anywhere near it since. Every single one of his students accounted for, standing together near the doorway, flashlights all pointed in the same direction, toward him, toward the chair, toward whatever had apparently just stood up from it. He stood in that doorway watching the chair slow its rocking on its own, gradually, the way it should have finished doing half a minute before he ever turned to look, the motion growing smaller and smaller until it finally stilled completely, and none of his students, checking their own memories against his afterward, could say for certain they'd seen anyone sit down or stand up from it besides him, though more than one of them admitted, quietly, once they were safely back in the parking lot, that they'd felt a presence near that chair the entire time he'd been resting in it. A sense of someone else waiting close by for their turn. I collected other stories over my 3 years there. Smaller ones. Fragments, really. The kind that get passed around in whispers between classes rather than told formally to a whole room. A janitor who refused to clean the east stairwell alone after sundown, an old servant's staircase left over from the mansion's original construction, narrow and steep in a way that made you keep one hand on the railing without thinking about it. The wood worn smooth and slightly hollowed in the center of each step from generations of feet long before any student ever walked them, who would always find another staff member to accompany him, even if it meant waiting an extra 20 minutes for someone to be free. Standing near the bottom of those stairs with his supplies until company arrived rather than climb them by himself. A substitute teacher who lasted exactly 1 day in a particular classroom on the 3rd floor before requesting, politely but firmly, never to be assigned there again. Refusing to explain why, beyond saying she'd felt something in that room she didn't have words for and didn't want to develop any. Something that had made the hair on her arms stand up every single time she turned her back to thee. Class to write on the board. A student, a year ahead of me, who swore she'd seen a shape standing at the end of the 2nd floor hallway during a late rehearsal. Gone the instant she blinked, tall and still, in a way that no living person waiting casually in a hallway ever quite manages to be, and who told the story only once, to a small group of us, with a kind of controlled, careful reluctance that made it clear she wasn't telling it for entertainment. What struck me most, collecting these stories over the years, wasn't any single incident on its own. Plenty of old buildings creak and settle in ways that sound, in the dark, like footsteps or slamming doors. Plenty of teenagers convince themselves they've seen something in a shadowy hallway during a moment of ordinary nervous imagination, especially in a building already primed by decades of rumor to be seen that way. What struck me was the consistency, the sheer number of separate, unconnected people, across different years, different roles within the building, different levels of belief going in, who all ended up describing some version of the same feeling. A sense of being watched from just outside your field of vision. A specific, unshakable reluctance to be alone in certain rooms after dark. A reluctance that persisted even among people who insisted, in the same breath, that they didn't actually believe in ghosts. The auditorium, above every other room in that mansion, kept coming up, again and again, as though whatever lived in that building had settled most comfortably into the space that had once been its grandest room, its ballroom, before the walls were rearranged and a stage was built and rows of folding chairs replaced whatever had once stood there for the family who built the place. I joined Decca mostly for the ghost hunts, I'll admit that now, more than for any real interest in business competitions, and I went on exactly one hunt myself before I graduated. A smaller, quieter version of the ones our advisor used to describe. Just a handful of us with flashlights, standing in that same auditorium on a cold evening after most of the building had emptied out. The parking lot outside, down to 2 cars, and the hallway lights along the way switched off behind us, one by one, as we walked deeper into the building. Nothing dramatic happened while I was there. No crashing props, no thrown buckets, no rocking chairs, and part of me, walking back out to the car afterward, felt almost disappointed. The way you feel disappointed when a story you've heard secondhand fails to repeat itself for you, personally. But I remember, standing near the center of that dark room, flashlight beam cutting a thin path across the stage where those spears had supposedly fallen years before I ever set foot in the building, feeling a cold settle across the back of my neck that had nothing to do with the temperature outside. A cold that seemed to gather specifically at the base of my skull and stay there the entire time. We lingered in that room. I remember glancing toward that same mismatched wooden chair, still sitting exactly where it had always sat. Dust undisturbed along its arms in the beam of my flashlight, and deciding, without quite admitting to myself why, that I did not want to be the one to sit in it that night. I don't know what actually lives or lived in that building, and I've long since stopped expecting a tidy answer. I never got a clean answer from anyone. Not the teacher with 20 years of stories, not the Decca advisor with his flashlights and his easy, well-practiced delivery, not even the older staff who had worked there long enough to have collected theories of their own, half-serious guesses about which member of the original family might have died unhappy inside those walls. Might have never quite left the ballroom where presumably they'd once hosted parties nobody remembers anymore, dancing under the same high ceiling that later watched over spelling tests and pep rallies, and eventually a handful of teenagers with flashlights daring each other to stay a few minutes longer. What I do know is that I have never, in all the years since I graduated, walked into an old building after dark without some small, involuntary part of my attention checking the shadows at the edges of the room, waiting to see if any of them decide to move on their own. A habit I picked up in that place and have never quite managed to set back down. Last year, a former classmate who still keeps in touch with some of the staff told me the school had finally scheduled renovations for the old auditorium, tearing out the stage entirely, sealing the crawl space beneath it for good, replacing the last of the mismatched furniture that had been sitting in that room since before any of us were born. That chair among it, headed for a dumpster along with decades of accumulated props nobody had ever bothered to inventory properly. I asked her, half joking, whether she thought that would finally put an end to the stories. She didn't answer right away, and I remember the pause stretching out long enough that I almost asked if she was still there. When she finally did answer, she said that one of the contractors doing the initial walkthrough had refused, without explanation, to go back into the building alone to finish measuring the room, had come out to the parking lot pale and short of breath, and unwilling to say exactly what had prompted it, and that he had told the crew, flatly, that he'd rather lose the job than spend another minute in there by himself after the sun went down. This happened to my mother's uncle in India sometime in the 1970s. I never knew exactly what year it was, because my family always referred to it as something that happened before everything changed. By the time I was old enough to hear the story properly, nobody seemed interested in dates anymore. They remembered the man he had been before that night, and the man he became afterward. That difference was all that mattered. For most of my childhood, I did not believe the story. I thought it was one of those family legends that grows darker every time it is repeated. Every family seems to have at least one. A strange death, a cursed room, a relative who saw something no one else saw. People tell the same story for 20 or 30 years. Small details get added, and eventually nobody remembers where the truth ends and the dramatic parts begin. That was what I assumed had happened here. Then, when I was older, I met the man at the center of it. After that, I stopped laughing whenever my mother told the story. I will call him Uncle, because using his real name would not add anything. Before the incident, Uncle was considered one of the most intelligent and dependable men in his village. That description did not come only from my mother. I heard it from several older relatives who had known him before I was born. He worked as an accountant. In that part of rural India during the 1970s, that carried real weight. He was educated at a time when many people around him had received very little formal schooling. He could keep books, calculate complicated figures in his head, prepare documents, read legal notices, and help people understand money matters they did not fully understand themselves. Villagers trusted him. Shopkeepers trusted him. Farmers came to him when they needed help with accounts. People sometimes traveled from neighboring villages just to have him look over papers. He was not rich, but he had a reputation. My mother said he was also extremely particular. His shirts were always clean. His ledgers were neat. He wrote numbers in straight columns. If he borrowed something, he returned it. If he told someone he would arrive at 4 and at 4 in the afternoon, he arrived at 4. He was not a dreamy person. He did not tell ghost stories. He did not drink. He did not use drugs. He was not known for superstition, although, like almost everyone in the village, he had grown up hearing old warnings from parents and grandparents. Some warnings were practical. Do not wander near wells after dark. Do not sleep under certain trees during storms. Do not travel alone through fields during monsoon season. Others were harder to explain. One warning in particular had been repeated to him since childhood. If you were alone at night and heard someone you loved calling your name from somewhere they could not possibly be, you were not supposed to answer. You were not supposed to follow. And above all, you were not supposed to turn around to look. The belief was that certain things could imitate familiar voices. They did not call you like a stranger. They used someone you trusted, someone whose voice would reach past common sense. Sometimes, according to older people, they used the voice of a living family member. Sometimes they used the dead. As a younger man, Uncle supposedly dismissed most of that as village talk. At least, that is what my mother always said. He did not openly insult the beliefs of older relatives, but he was educated and practical. He believed fear could make people hear strange things. He believed tired minds could misinterpret animals, wind, distant voices, or shadows. That changed after his daughter died. She was 5 years old. I never knew exactly what killed her. My mother said she became sick very quickly. One version of the story said it was a severe fever. Another relative believed it was some kind of infection. Medical care in the area was limited, transportation was difficult, and by the time the family understood how serious it was, there was little anyone could do. She died at home. That detail matters. The family lived in an old house that had belonged to relatives before them. It was not enormous, but it was larger than many houses in the village. The walls were thick, built from brick and plaster. There was an inner courtyard open to the sky, with rooms arranged around it. The front section had a sitting area where Uncle sometimes met clients. Behind that was a long central passage. On one side were 2 bedrooms. On the other was a storage room and a smaller room where account books and papers were kept. The kitchen was toward the rear. Beyond the kitchen was a narrow cupboard area that opened into the courtyard. A staircase near the back led to the flat roof. There was also an old room near the courtyard that the family rarely used after the little girl died. That had been her room. From what I was told, she had not actually slept there alone every night. She was 5. Sometimes she slept beside her mother. Sometimes she fell asleep in her own small bed. But her clothes had been kept there. Her toys had been there. There had been drawings on the wall. After she died, most of her things were eventually removed, but the room stayed mostly unused. My mother said nobody made a formal decision to avoid it. They simply did. That happens sometimes after someone dies. A room becomes too connected to a person. People stop entering because entering means remembering. For months after the child's death, Uncle reportedly threw himself into work. He traveled constantly. He took more clients. He stayed away from the house for longer hours. Relatives thought he was trying to avoid grief. He never spoke much about his daughter after the funeral. He had loved her deeply. Everyone agreed on that. She had followed him around constantly when he was home. She would apparently sit near his desk while he worked and ask him pointless questions just to keep his attention. She had a particular way of calling him, not father in a formal way. She used a short family name for him. Everyone in the house knew it. My mother refused to repeat the exact name when she first told me this story. At the time, I thought she was being dramatic. Years later, I understood why. The incident happened several months after the girl died, maybe closer to a year. Nobody was sure. It was during the hotter part of the year. Electricity had reached the village, but power cuts were common. Some nights, the lights flickered repeatedly. Other nights, electricity disappeared for hours. People kept kerosene lamps ready because once the power went out, darkness inside those old houses was complete. There were no streetlights shining through windows, no glow from advertising signs, no phones with bright screens. Once the sun went down and electricity failed, you had flame or darkness, nothing in between. On the evening everything happened, Uncle had returned home late from work. His wife had gone with some relatives to visit family in another village. He was not supposed to be completely alone. An older male cousin had planned to stay with him that night, but something changed, and the cousin never came. Uncle did not care. He had slept alone in the house before. He ate a simple dinner, washed, and sat in the front room working through some account books. The electricity was still on then. There was a ceiling fan turning above him. The light bulb in the room gave off the dull yellow light common in older houses. Outside, the village had mostly gone quiet. During the day, there would have been children, animals, bicycles, people calling to each other, utensils clattering, radios. Late at night, everything changed. Sound carried farther. A dog barking several houses away could seem close. Someone closing a wooden door might echo down an entire lane. Uncle continued working. He was reviewing numbers for a client. My mother always emphasized that point. He was doing calculations, writing, checking totals. He was fully awake. There was no suggestion that he had gone to sleep or been dreaming. Sometime after midnight, the power went out. The fan slowed. The bulb dimmed. Then the room went black. Uncle apparently cursed quietly because he had been in the middle of working. He knew where the kerosene lamp was. There was one kept on a shelf beside the account room. He stood up and felt his way along the wall. The house had become extremely quiet. Without the fan, he could hear insects outside. He could hear his own footsteps. The floor was hard and cool beneath his feet. He found the lamp. He lit it. The flame was weak at first, then steadied. The light did not travel far. That is something people who grow up with constant electric lighting often underestimate. A small kerosene lamp does not fill a house with light. It creates a small circle around you and makes everything beyond that circle seem even darker. Uncle returned to the front room. He tried to continue working. He managed maybe another 10 minutes. Then he heard something in the hallway behind him. At first he thought it was a rat. Old houses had them. The sound was soft, a small scrape, then silence. He kept writing. A few seconds later, he heard it again. This time it sounded less like scratching, more like a bare foot touching the floor. He stopped, listened nothing. He turned his head slightly toward the hallway, but did not get up. He called out, asking if someone was there. No answer. He waited. The house stayed silent. He told himself it was an animal. Then he went back to his work. That should have been the end of it. A minute or two later, he heard his daughter. Not a sound that reminded him of her. Not a child somewhere outside. Her voice. Inside the house. Calling him. My mother said that when Uncle eventually told one relative about the beginning of that night, he was very precise about this. He did not say, "I thought it sounded like her." He said he knew it was her voice. There was no doubt. The first call came from somewhere behind him in the central passage. Quiet, almost playful. The exact way his daughter used to call when she wanted him to look away from his books. He stopped breathing. The pen remained in his hand. For several seconds, he did not move. His first reaction was apparently not terror. It was grief. That is one of the reasons the story bothers me. He knew his daughter was dead. He had attended the cremation. He had carried that grief for months. But the voice was so accurate that for one instant, knowledge did not matter. His body reacted before his mind did. He almost answered. Then, something old and deeply buried in his memory surfaced. Do not answer a voice that cannot be there. Do not turn. He lowered his eyes to the account book. He tried to breathe normally. The flame in the lamp moved slightly. There was no obvious wind. He waited. The voice came again. Closer, this time from the hallway entrance directly behind his chair. The same affectionate call. There was no desperation in it. No crying. That would have been easier, I think. It sounded normal, like his daughter believed nothing had happened to her. Like she had simply walked into the room after playing somewhere else in the house. Uncle's hands began shaking. He put the pen down. He did not turn. He supposedly whispered a prayer. The voice came a third time, a little louder. Then she said something else. A short sentence. According to my mother, it was something the girl had often said when she wanted him to follow her. Something like, "Come see." That was when he became truly frightened. Because the voice was not simply repeating his name. It was communicating, waiting for him. He remained in the chair. He knew the old warnings. You did not acknowledge it. You did not invite it closer. You did not turn to see who was using the voice. He tried to convince himself that someone outside was playing a cruel joke. But the voice was inside. There were no open windows near the hallway. And whoever it was knew how his daughter had spoken to him privately. Then he heard a small laugh. Her laugh. From deeper inside the house. It seemed to move away from him. Down the central passage. Toward the courtyard. That was somehow worse. He sat alone with a lamp burning beside him. He could smell kerosene. Sweat ran down his neck. His shirt had begun sticking to his back. He wanted to leave the house. The front door was only several steps away. He could have walked outside and gone to a neighbor. But leaving meant standing. Standing meant turning enough to see the hallway. He stayed where he was. Then, something touched the wall. A soft tap. Farther down the passage. Another tap. Then another, moving slowly away. It sounded like small fingers trailing along the plaster. Uncle squeezed his eyes shut. The sound stopped. Several seconds passed. Then the voice spoke from the courtyard, much farther away now. Still his daughter, calling him again. He did not answer. He started reciting prayers under his breath. I am told he repeated the same lines continuously. He was afraid if he stopped speaking, he might answer without meaning to. Then the voice changed position again. It came from the room that had belonged to his daughter. He knew that instantly. The doorway to that room was beyond the courtyard passage. The voice came through the darkness, clearly. She called him, then asked why he would not come to her. Imagine that. Your child dies. Months pass. You survive because you force yourself to accept that she is gone. Then one night, alone in the house where she died, her voice asks why you are ignoring her. I do not know how long I would have lasted. Apparently, Uncle lasted longer than I would have expected. He stayed in the front room. He did not look. Then the voice began crying, quietly at first. Little broken sobs, exactly the kind of sound a child makes when trying not to cry loudly. He later claimed that this was the moment he almost lost control. A parent is conditioned to respond to that sound. Every instinct tells you to go to your child. He pushed the chair backward, then stopped himself. The crying continued. She called him again. This time, she sounded hurt. She asked him why he had left her alone. Uncle covered his ears. The sound did not become quieter. He pressed his palms harder against them. Still, he heard her. The voice was no longer only in the hallway. It seemed to come through the walls, through the floor. Perhaps that was fear. Perhaps sound simply carried strangely in the house. I do not know. Then the crying stopped. Complete silence. Uncle slowly lowered his hands. The lamp flame had become very small. He adjusted the wick. The flame rose. The shadows on the walls stretched and moved. He stared at the account book without reading a single number. Minutes passed. Nothing happened. He began to think it was over. Maybe he had experienced some kind of breakdown caused by grief. Maybe he had imagined everything. The house remained still. He looked toward the front door. If he stood carefully and kept facing forward, he could reach it without looking down the hallway. He decided to leave. He picked up the lamp. He stood. His legs were shaking. He took one step toward the door. Then he heard a footstep behind him. Not a child's step. Heavy, slow, the floor gave a faint creak. He stopped. Another step. Closer, then another. Whatever was behind him was approaching from the hallway. Uncle held the lamp in front of his chest. The flame shook because his hand was shaking. He did not turn. He moved toward the front door. Behind him, another step. Then, silence. He reached the door. His fingers found the wooden bolt. He started sliding it back. From directly behind him, his daughter whispered his name. Not from the hallway. Not from the courtyard. Immediately behind his shoulder. Uncle froze. The voice was close enough that he said he felt something like cool breath against the back of his neck. Every hair on his arms rose. His entire body locked. The bolt was halfway open. He could have pulled the door and run. Instead, he remained standing there. Then the voice said one word. Papa, according to my mother, Uncle had never allowed anyone to repeat exactly what happened next. But everyone agreed on the basic fact. He turned around. Maybe grief was stronger than fear. Maybe curiosity broke him. Maybe some part of him still wanted to believe his little girl had somehow come home. Whatever the reason, after resisting for what may have been nearly an hour, he looked behind him, and whatever he saw destroyed something in him. This is the part nobody knows. He never described it. Not to his wife, not to his brothers, not to priests, not to doctors, not even years later when people begged him. He turned. Then, neighbors heard screaming. Not one scream. Several, a grown man screaming from inside the house in the middle of the night. The first neighbor to reach the property found the front door open. Uncle was outside in the courtyard. Not the front yard. The inner courtyard. Nobody could explain how he got there. He had been at the front entrance only moments earlier, according to the fragments he later gave. Yet when the neighbors found him, he was crouched near the old room that had belonged to his daughter. The kerosene lamp lay broken several feet away. Oil had spilled across the floor. Fortunately, it had gone out instead of starting a fire. Uncle was pressed against the courtyard wall. His hands were over his face. He was making a low sound, not words, just a repeated noise. The neighbors approached carefully. He fought them. This shocked everyone because he had never been a violent man. 3 adults had to restrain him. He kept trying to look toward the doorway of his daughter's room. Then he would immediately cover his face again. He seemed unable to decide whether he wanted to see it or was terrified of seeing it. Someone went inside the room. Nothing was there. The room was empty. The small bed had already been removed months earlier. Only an old wooden chest remained. No person, no animal, no sign anyone had entered. They searched the house. Every door was locked except the front entrance. The windows were secured. There was no intruder. Uncle's wife returned the next morning. By then, he had stopped screaming. That did not mean he was better. He sat on the floor with his back against the wall and stared ahead. When his wife touched him, he flinched. When she asked what had happened, he looked at her, but did not seem to understand the question. Eventually, he spoke. He asked where their daughter was. His wife began crying. She reminded him that their daughter had died. Uncle shook his head. Then, he became agitated and told her never to say that inside the house. He insisted the child could hear them. That was the beginning. In the following days, his condition worsened. He barely slept. When he did sleep, he woke screaming. He refused to remain in dark rooms. He would not sit with his back toward a doorway. If anyone called his name from another room, he became visibly frightened. Eventually, relatives learned to walk into his line of sight before speaking to him. The most disturbing change involved his daughter's old room. He would not enter it. He would not pass the door after sunset. During the day, if he had to cross the courtyard, he kept his eyes lowered. At night, he insisted the room be locked. Then he insisted a piece of furniture be pushed against the door. His wife asked why. He would not explain. He only said that if anyone heard their daughter inside, they must not open the door. At first, the family thought grief had finally overwhelmed him. Doctors were consulted. Some believed he had suffered a psychological collapse. Others thought lack of sleep was making things worse. Medication helped him rest, but did not restore the man they remembered. He stopped working regularly. His handwriting changed. That detail always stayed with my mother. Before the incident, Uncle's handwriting had been famous in the family for being almost unnaturally neat. Afterward, his writing became shaky. Numbers wandered across pages. He made simple calculation errors. Eventually, clients stopped coming. A man who had once handled complicated accounts could no longer reliably add columns of basic figures. He started mumbling to himself. Sometimes relatives recognized prayers. Sometimes the words made no sense. Other times, he seemed to be having quiet conversations with someone who was not visible. If asked who he was speaking to, he became angry or frightened. The family moved out of the old house. That happened within a few years. My mother believed Uncle's wife pushed for it because she could not bear watching him react to the building. The daughter's room was emptied completely. Before leaving, relatives found strange marks on the inside of the door. My mother did not know whether those marks had existed before. She described them as scratches low on the wood. That part may have been exaggerated over the years. I cannot verify it. What I can verify is what happened to Uncle afterward. He never recovered. There were periods when he improved. Sometimes he could hold an ordinary conversation. Sometimes he remembered old clients and events perfectly. On good days, relatives said flashes of his old personality returned. He could make a joke. He could ask intelligent questions. He could discuss politics. Then, something would happen. A child would call from outside. A woman would say his name from another room. The power would fail, and he would change immediately. His face would tighten. He would look toward every doorway. Sometimes he would whisper, "Do not answer," over and over. "Do not answer, do not answer, do not answer." The strangest thing was his reaction to people asking what he had seen. For years, relatives tried. His brothers asked, his wife asked, religious figures asked, doctors asked. He always refused. Sometimes he acted as if he did not remember. Sometimes he simply stared. But on several occasions, people pushed too hard. When that happened, he became terrified, not upset. Terrified, he would shake his head violently and cover his eyes. Once, according to my mother, one of his brothers told him that describing the thing might help him. Uncle looked at him and said, "If I tell you what was standing there, you will start listening for it too." Then he refused to speak for the rest of the day. That sentence was repeated often in my family. I still do not know whether it was exactly what he said. Years passed. My mother grew older. She moved away. Eventually, I was born. By the time I first heard about Uncle, he was already an old man. To me, he was more story than person. My mother would mention him whenever people talked about paranormal things. She insisted the story was true. I would argue. I said grief could cause hallucinations. Sleep deprivation could do strange things. He might have suffered a neurological event. Maybe he had developed a severe psychiatric illness unrelated to the voice. Maybe family superstition shaped how everyone remembered the incident. My mother never got angry. She would simply say, "You did not know him before." That was her answer every time. Then, about a year before Uncle died, I finally met him. I was visiting relatives in India. He was living with family by then. The house was completely different from the one where the incident occurred. More modern, brighter. There were electric lights in every room. A television played in the background. Children moved through the house. It should have felt safe. I remember being strangely excited to see him. I wanted to study him. That sounds cruel now. At the time, I thought meeting him might finally confirm my suspicion that the whole family story was exaggerated. Maybe I expected a harmless old man with dementia. Maybe I wanted proof that nothing supernatural had happened. He was sitting in a chair near a window when I entered, very thin, white hair, loose clothing. His hands rested on his knees. At first, he did not look unusual. Then he looked at me. I cannot properly explain what bothered me about his eyes. I have met people with dementia. I have met people who were deeply depressed. I have met people who were mentally ill. This was different. He looked exhausted, not physically tired. It was as if he had been afraid for decades and had never truly relaxed again. His eyes kept shifting past me, toward the doorway, toward the hallway, back to me, then toward the doorway again. Someone introduced us. I greeted him. He nodded. For a few minutes, we talked about ordinary things. He asked where I lived. He asked about my work. His voice was quiet, but clearer than I expected. I remember thinking my mother had exaggerated how damaged he was. Then the electricity went out. Just like that. The television died. The fan above us slowed. The lights disappeared. The room became dark. Someone laughed and said the power would probably return soon. I heard people moving to find candles. Uncle changed immediately. His hands gripped the chair. His breathing became fast. Someone told him it was all right. He ignored them. His eyes were fixed on the hallway. I could barely see his face. Then, from somewhere deeper in the house, a little girl called for her mother. There were several children visiting that day. It was completely normal. But Uncle made a sound I will never forget. A small gasp. His whole body recoiled. He whispered, "Do not turn." The relatives went quiet. He said it again. Louder, "Do not turn." I was standing near him. I looked down. His hands were trembling. Not slightly. Violently, someone lit a candle. The flame illuminated part of his face. Tears were running down his cheeks. I had not asked him anything yet. I almost decided not to. But I had grown up hearing this story. Curiosity won. I sat near him. I asked gently if he remembered the old house. He looked at me. The fear in his expression became even stronger. I told him I had heard what happened. He looked toward the doorway. Then back at me. I asked if he really heard his daughter that night. He closed his eyes. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then he nodded once. That was enough to make my skin crawl. I asked one more question. I regret it. I asked, "What did you see when you turned around?" His eyes opened. For the first time since I entered the house, he looked directly at me without glancing away. The expression on his face made me stop breathing. There was no confusion there, no struggle to remember. He understood exactly what I was asking. He leaned toward me. I expected him to whisper an answer. Instead, he said, very clearly, "Never ask someone to bring that picture back into their head." Then he turned his chair slightly so he no longer faced me. That was all. He refused to speak to me again. He died about a year later. Natural causes, as far as I know. After his death, I asked my mother whether he had ever told anyone what he saw. She said no, not once. For decades, he carried it without describing it. That is what bothers me more than the voice. People tell frightening stories eventually, even if they are embarrassed, even if they think nobody will believe them. A person usually reaches a point where they want someone else to know. Uncle never did. Whatever he saw after hearing his dead daughter's voice, he apparently believed describing it was worse than keeping it inside his own mind for the rest of his life. I still believe there are rational possibilities. Grief, trauma, a hallucination. A psychiatric break. Maybe he turned and saw an ordinary object in a dark hallway, and his mind transformed it into something horrifying. Maybe what destroyed him was not what stood there, but what his own brain created. That explanation is possible. I prefer it. But there is one part of the story my mother told me only after Uncle died. His wife had kept it secret for years. The morning after the incident, while relatives were caring for him, she entered their daughter's old room. She wanted to understand why he had been found crouching outside it. The room was empty. Nothing had been disturbed. She was about to leave when she noticed something on the plaster wall beside the doorway. Their daughter had been small. When she was alive, she sometimes drew on the walls with bits of charcoal from the kitchen fire. Her mother had cleaned those marks after the funeral. She remembered doing it herself. But that morning, there was a fresh black line on the wall at the height of a 5-year-old child's hand. Under it were 3 roughly written words. The letters were childish. Uneven, they said that Papa had finally looked. And according to my mother, Uncle's wife had that section of the wall covered before he ever came back into the room. My friend Steve told me this story freshman year of high school. sitting on the back steps of his house one afternoon while we were supposed to be doing homework, and it happened, according to him, to his older brother Tim a couple of years before that, back when Tim was away at college in New Hampshire, living in a rented house with a few friends near the edge of town. I want to tell it the way Steve told it to me, and then tell you the two things that happened afterward, because those two things are the reason I still think about this story more than 15 years later, long after I should have been able to write the whole thing off as nothing more than a good campfire tale and simply move on with my life. Tim was staying, that particular weekend, at a house a few of his college friends rented together off campus, a big old drafty place at the edge of town where the streetlights ran out and the woods started. The kind of house college kids get because it's cheap and nobody minds that the porch sags or that half the windows don't open properly anymore. The house had a long gravel driveway that curved back from the road through a stand of trees before opening up in front of a wraparound porch, and Tim used to joke, Steve told me, that the place felt more like a hunting cabin than a proper rental. Isolated enough that on a clear night, you could stand on that porch and not see another house light anywhere across the tree line. It was late, close to 2 in the morning, and Tim and his friend had been up doing whatever college kids do at that hour, sprawled in the living room with the television going low, and somewhere in the middle of it they got the kind of craving you only get at 2 in the morning, specific and completely unreasonable, and decided they needed Dunkin' Donuts. The problem was that the nearest one wasn't nearby. It was across the state line, close enough to be tempting and far enough to be a genuinely bad idea, and getting there meant taking a narrow 2-lane highway that cut straight through a long stretch of dense New Hampshire woods, no streetlights, no shoulder to speak of, just trees pressing in close on both sides the whole way, close enough in places that the branches nearly brushed the edges of the road. They made the drive out without incident, got their coffee and donuts, and started the drive back toward the house, full dark all around them. The kind of dark you only get out in the woods away from any real town. Headlights, the only real light for miles. Tim described it to Steve, and Steve described it to me as a pleasant enough drive at first. Tired and a little giddy the way you are at that hour, windows cracked, radio playing low. Somewhere on that stretch of highway, a car pulled out in front of them, seemingly from nowhere, no side road that either of them could remember passing. No driveway, nothing that explained where it had come from, no headlights sweeping across the trees ahead of time, the way a car merging onto the road normally announces itself before you actually see it. One moment the road ahead was empty, their own headlights the only light for what felt like miles, and the next moment it was simply there, holding a steady position 100 feet or so ahead of them, as though it had always been driving that exact stretch of road at that exact distance. It was small, a compact car, red, though the red looked strange in their headlights, duller than it should have been, almost the color of something left out in the weather too long, rust dulled and faded in a way that made Tim think, absurdly, of dried blood more than paint. What struck Tim immediately, before anything else about it registered, was that the car had no visible markings anywhere on its body. No make or model badge, no dealership sticker, nothing. Just smooth red metal, as though every identifying detail had been deliberately scraped away by someone who wanted the car to remain. In every practical sense, anonymous. The only thing about it that stood out at all was its license plate. And even that wasn't a normal plate. Not one either of them recognized from any state. Just a pale background with 2 letters on it. A black O and a green M, colored in a way that made them look almost hand-painted rather than printed. The edges slightly uneven, as though whoever had made that plate had done it by hand rather than run it through any official process. Around this time, Tim told Steve, some odd things started happening that neither of them could fully explain. though he was always careful to add that any one of them on its own could easily have been coincidence. His phone, which had been showing full bars a few minutes earlier, dropped to no service at all. The little bars just gone. No explanation. Right around the same stretch of road where the car appeared. The screen sitting there, useless in the cup holder for the rest of the drive. The radio, which had been tuned to some late-night jazz station, cut through a burst of static and landed, for a few seconds, on a completely different station playing Smells Like Teen Spirit, loud and distorted, before snapping back to the jazz station as if nothing had happened. The abrupt volume of it making both of them jump in their seats before the quiet horns returned. Tim admitted, telling the story later, that he couldn't be sure the radio hadn't just been drifting between stations the way car radios do out in the middle of nowhere, that the phone thing could have been a simple dead zone, common enough on rural highways that far from any town. But taken together, right at that moment, with that car sitting directly in front of them, it felt like something. A series of small wrongnesses stacking on top of each other until the whole night felt tilted slightly off its axis. Tim and his friends started to get a bad feeling about the whole situation. The kind of feeling that doesn't have a clear cause but sits low in your stomach anyway, tightening a little with every mile that passed. Tim eased off the gas, wanting to fall back, wanting to put some distance between them and whatever was in front of them, happy to just let the car go on ahead without them and disappear around the next bend for good. The car slowed down, too, exactly matching him, staying the same distance ahead no matter how much he slowed, as though it were tethered to his own speed by an invisible line stretched taut between the two vehicles. Tim thought maybe it was nothing. Maybe the other driver was just being cautious on a dark, unfamiliar road, but something about the way it slowed the instant he did, with no lag, no hesitation, no gradual easing off, didn't sit right with him at all. He decided to try the opposite. He pressed down on the gas, thinking that if he sped up enough, he could close the distance and pass the car outright, get around it and put it behind him for good. The car sped up too, staying exactly the same distance ahead, and Tim said that was the moment real fear set in, both of them going quiet in the car. The donuts and coffee forgotten in the back seat, both of them just staring straight ahead at that dull red shape, holding its position no matter what he did. They came up on a curve in the road, trees crowding close on both sides, thick enough that the headlights barely reached past the first row of trunks, and they watched the car go around it and disappear from view for a moment. The dull red taillights swallowed by the dark almost instantly. Tim made a decision then, pulling the car to a stop right there on the empty highway, both of them sitting frozen with their hearts hammering, engine idling, headlights cutting a short cone of light into the dark trees ahead and revealing nothing beyond it but more trees, more darkness. No sign of the road continuing past what they could see. Neither of them could say afterward exactly how long they sat there like that, radio silent now, phones still showing no bars, the only sound the low idle of the engine and their own breathing. It felt, Tim said, like 20 minutes, though it may have been far less. Adrenaline stretching time out the way it does when you're genuinely afraid. Every second, feeling twice its actual length. Eventually, they worked up the nerve to keep going, both of them quietly hoping that whatever had been pacing them had simply moved on, gone about its business, given up, and continued wherever it had originally been headed before they'd crossed its path. It hadn't. The instant they came around that same curve, there it was, the same dull red car, sitting at the exact same distance ahead of them as before, as though it had never left, as though it had simply been waiting there the whole time for them to catch up, holding perfectly still until it was ready to move again in step with them. Tim said that was when he understood, on some level below conscious thought. that whatever they were dealing with was not interested in letting them go easily, and that there was nothing merciful about the shape of that car sitting patiently ahead of them in the dark, waiting to see what they would try next. They kept driving after that, no longer trying to speed up or slow down, no longer trying to test it in any way, just holding a steady pace and hoping to make it back to the rental house before anything worse happened. Eventually, the highway split, one branch curving off toward town, back toward the lit windows and familiar streets where Tim's friends were waiting up for them, and the other branch running deeper into the woods, unmarked, unlit, disappearing into darkness that gave no hint of where it led or how far back it went. The car ahead of them took the branch into the woods without slowing, without any indication it had even considered the other option, and Tim took the branch toward town, watching in his rearview mirror as the red shape shrank and finally vanished around a bend, swallowed by the trees like it had never been there at all. They made it back to the house a little after 3 in the morning, gravel crunching under the tires, louder than it ever had before as they came up that long driveway, both of them scanning the tree line on either side out of some instinct neither could name, half expecting to see a dull shape parked somewhere among the trunks, watching. They pulled up in front of the porch, killed the engine, and sat there a moment in the sudden silence before finally forcing themselves out of the car. Both of them were shaking, and neither of them was able to fully explain to their roommates, still up and half asleep on the couch in front of the television, exactly why they looked the way they did. Why Tim kept glancing back at the front door every few minutes as though checking it was still locked. Tim told Steve that he sat out on the porch of that rental house for almost an hour afterward, wide awake, wrapped in a blanket someone had thrown at him, staring out at the dark tree line at the edge of the property, where the driveway curved out of sight, half convinced that at any moment a pair of dull red taillights would come crawling into view between the trunks. They never did. Nobody at that house ever saw the car again. Not that night. Not for the rest of the semester, though Tim admitted that for weeks afterward, he found himself checking that same tree line every time he came home late, some part of him never quite able to fully trust that the driveway was empty until he'd actually walked its full length himself. He never drove that particular stretch of highway again if he could possibly help it, going the long way around through town instead, even when it added 20 minutes to the trip. And to this day, nobody in that rental house was ever quite able to laugh about that particular night the same way they laughed about their other college stories. I want to be honest and tell you that when Steve first told me this story freshman year, sitting on those back steps, I didn't believe a word of it. I told him so, more or less directly, and he admitted a little sheepishly that he wasn't entirely sure he believed it either, that it was just something his brother told at parties sometimes, half joke, half genuine unease, and that Tim himself got quiet and strange whenever anyone pushed him too hard for details, always changing the subject a little too quickly whenever someone asked what he thought the car actually was. We filed it away, both of us, the way you file away any good scary story a friend tells you, just entertaining, a little unsettling, not something you actually think is true. The kind of thing you bring up again months later, mostly for the fun of watching someone else's face change while they listen. That changed about a year or two later, sometime around 2008 or 2009, when I was sitting at my desk in my bedroom doing homework with the local talk radio station playing quietly in the background, the way it always did in our house in the evenings. More for the noise than for anything I was actually listening to, the sound drifting up the hallway from the kitchen, where my mom kept it on low while she cooked dinner. A news bulletin came on, interrupting whatever program had been playing, reporting a murder in a neighboring county the night before. The details were sparse, the way early crime reports usually are. But one detail caught my attention hard enough that I actually stopped what I was doing, set my pencil down, and reached over to turn up the volume on the little radio sitting on my desk. The sole witness, the report said, had seen a car leaving the scene shortly before the body was discovered, and described it specifically as a red compact car with an unusual license plate, a black O and a green M. I sat there completely still for a moment, feeling something cold settle into my chest, because I was in suburban Orange County, California, thousands of miles from that stretch of New Hampshire highway, and there was absolutely no reason a car matching that exact oddly specific description should be showing up in a local crime report near my own house. I remember thinking, very clearly, that I had to be misremembering the details of Steve's story, filling in gaps with details from the news report without meaning to. My brain playing tricks on me the way it sometimes does with half-remembered stories, stitching two unrelated things together into something that only felt connected. I ran into Steve at school the next day and asked him, trying to sound casual, whether he'd happened to hear the news the night before. He had. He'd heard the exact same report on the exact same station, driving to school with his own radio on, and he described the car in the exact same terms without any prompting from me. The black O, the green M, the dull red paint. We stood there in the hallway between classes, just looking at each other, both of us understanding, without really wanting to say it out loud, that we had just confirmed two things at once. Neither of us was imagining it or misremembering it. And whatever that car actually was, it was real. And it was not confined to some stretch of highway in New Hampshire. It had a reach that neither of us could explain. And it had, apparently, been somewhere very close to home. The second thing happened much more recently, just this past May, to a friend of mine named Blake. Someone Steve and I had both known for years. Someone who had heard the story more than once over the years, the way you hear any well-worn story that gets passed around a friend group. He was driving home late one night, close to 2 in the morning again, after dropping his girlfriend off at her place, headlights the only light on a road with no street lamps and houses set back too far from the pavement to offer any glow of their own. For some reason, some small decision that felt completely unremarkable at the time. He chose to take a route home that ran through a canyon on the edge of town instead of his usual road, a narrow, winding stretch with steep hillsides on either side and almost no other traffic at that hour. The kind of road where your own headlights feel like the only proof the world still exists beyond your windshield. Partway through the canyon, a car pulled out in front of him, appearing in his headlights with no warning, no side street he could remember passing, no sign of where it had come from. Small, red, dull, and faded in a way that didn't quite match any color he could name later when he tried to describe it. A license plate with a black O and a green M, sitting there ahead of him on the empty road as though it had simply always been part of the canyon, waiting. Blake told us, later, that his stomach dropped the instant he registered it, that some part of his brain that had been half joking about the story for years suddenly understood, all at once and completely seriously, that it was not a joke at all, had never been a joke, no matter how many times he'd repeated it laughing at parties. He eased off the gas immediately, letting the car pull as far ahead as it wanted to go, not testing it, not speeding up, not doing anything except staying as far back as he possibly could, while still technically following the only road available to him through that canyon. He said the car seemed to sense his fear somehow, seemed almost satisfied by it, holding a steady, unhurried pace well ahead of him, never closing the distance, never demanding anything more from him than the simple fact of following behind it. They reached the far end of the canyon, where the road widened out and the houses of Blake's neighborhood started appearing again. porch lights and driveway lights breaking up the darkness for the first time in miles, ordinary and warm and almost unbearably welcome after everything that had come before. Right at that point, without warning, the red car ahead of him made a sharp U-turn in the middle of the empty road and started heading back the way it had come, back into the canyon, back into the dark. Passing within a few feet of Blake's own car as it went, close enough, he said, that for one full second he could have sworn he saw movement behind the windshield, though he refused, every time he told the story, to describe exactly what kind of movement it was. Blake drove the rest of the way home faster than he probably should have, hands tight on the wheel the whole way. Checking his mirrors so often, the road ahead blurred a little in his peripheral vision. He pulled into his own driveway, killed the engine, and sat there in the car for several minutes, with the headlights still shining on the front of his own dark house, unwilling for a while to actually make the short walk from the car to the front door. Some childish, animal part of his brain convinced that stepping out into the open would invite something to follow him the rest of the way home. He finally made himself go inside, locked the door behind him more deliberately than he normally would, checked it twice, and then, before doing anything else, walked through the entire downstairs of the house, turning on every light, kitchen, hallway, living room, even the small mudroom off the garage that nobody ever bothered lighting, as though enough brightness might undo whatever he'd just driven through. He told us afterward, with the kind of grim, embarrassed honesty you use when admitting something slightly ridiculous that happened to be completely true, that he'd needed to change his pants before he could even think about going to sleep that night, and that even after he finally climbed into bed, every light in the house still burning behind him, he lay awake a long time, listening for the sound of tires on his own driveway. That is everything I know about all of it secondhand from people I trust. None of it anything I could ever prove to a stranger, and none of it anything I've ever been able to fully explain away either. I've thought about it on and off for years now, turning it over the way you turn over any story that refuses to settle comfortably into either category, real or imagined, always circling back to the same handful of details that never quite line up with any rational explanation I can put together. My own theory, for whatever it's worth, is that whatever drives that car isn't confined to any one road or any one state, that it moves the way certain kinds of predators move, crossing whatever lines it needs to cross. County lines, state lines, borders that mean something to us and nothing at all to it. Always somewhere else, the moment anyone gets close enough to actually understand what they're looking at. Slipping back into the woods, into the canyon, into whatever dark, unmarked stretch of road happens to be waiting for it next. I have no proof of any of that. It's only conjecture, built out of 3 second-hand stories 15 years apart, and a single cold feeling that has never quite gone away. What I do know is that I have never once, since hearing Blake's story, taken an unfamiliar road home late at night without checking my mirrors more than I probably need to, without feeling a small, specific unease whenever a car pulls in ahead of me on an empty stretch of highway and holds a steady, patient distance for longer than feels natural. I catch myself, most nights, glancing at my own driveway before I get out of the car. Some small automatic habit I've picked up, without ever deciding to. Checking the tree line and the shadows along the fence the way Tim must have checked his own tree line for weeks after that night in New Hampshire. The way Blake told us he still checks his rearview mirror on the drive up his own street, even now, months later. Long after any rational part of him has decided there's nothing left to see. I tell myself every time that it's nothing. I have not yet been wrong. I try very hard not to think about what it would mean the day that changes, or what it would look like the first time I finally step out of my own car and find those dull red taillights already waiting somewhere down at the end of the driveway. My bedroom, growing up, had one particular flaw in its layout that I never thought much about until the year everything happened. Directly across from my bed, tucked into the far corner of the room, there was a small alcove, barely large enough to fit a chair if you'd wanted to put one there, and it sat in a permanent kind of shadow no matter what time of day it was. The closet door stood just in front of it, angled in a way that blocked both the overhead ceiling light and whatever ambient glow managed to creep in through the window from the street lamp outside once night fell. During the day, it was nothing, just an unremarkable dim patch you never gave a second thought to while getting dressed or grabbing a shirt off a hanger. At night, once the lights were off and my eyes had adjusted to the dark, that alcove became the one true patch of absolute black in an otherwise dim room, deeper somehow than the rest of the shadows, as though the darkness there had a thickness the surrounding dark didn't share. I want to explain, before I tell you what happened, that I had lived in that room for years by the time I was a senior in high school, and that corner had never once bothered me before, not even as a small child prone to ordinary nighttime fears. Kids sometimes get scared of dark corners when they're small, the classic fear of monsters under the bed or in the closet, but I had long since grown out of any of that. Spent countless nights sleeping in that room without a second thought toward that little alcove across from my bed. It was just architecture, just the unfortunate placement of a closet door relative to a light fixture. Nothing more than that. For years, until the particular night I'm about to describe, after which I never looked at that corner of my room the same way again. I remember it was a weeknight, late in my final year of high school, and I was lying in bed unable to sleep. The ordinary kind of insomnia that comes from a mind that won't quite settle down, replaying the day, worrying about an assignment due later that week. The usual restless static that keeps a teenager staring at the ceiling long after they should be asleep. I don't know exactly what time it was, though I remember checking my phone at one point and seeing that it was well past midnight. Closer to 2 than to 1. Late enough that the house had gone completely silent around me. No sounds from anyone else awake. No traffic noise from the street outside. Just the low hum of the refrigerator downstairs occasionally cycling on and off. Audible even through 2 closed doors and a flight of stairs. I want to describe what happened next as precisely as I can, because it has stayed lodged in my memory with a clarity that most ordinary memories from that period of my life simply don't have. I became aware, gradually, of a feeling I can only describe as being watched. You know the sensation, the one everyone has felt at some point. The prickling awareness that eyes are on you even when you have no direct evidence of it. The kind of feeling that makes the hair on your arms rise before your conscious mind has caught up to what your body already seems to know. I felt that, lying in my bed that night. And I want to be honest and tell you that it did not feel like an ordinary case of nerves or an overactive imagination working itself up in the dark. It felt specific. It felt directed. And underneath the simple fact of being watched, there was something else layered into it. Something I struggled for a long time afterward to put into words. A sense of malice that had weight to it. An intent behind the watching that felt deliberate and unmistakably unkind, the way you can sometimes tell, even without looking, that someone standing near you means you harm rather than simply happening to be nearby. I remember becoming aware at the same time of small physical sensations that I would normally have dismissed without a second thought. But that felt, in that particular moment, impossible to ignore. My own heartbeat, suddenly loud in my ears the way it gets when your body has quietly decided something is wrong before your mind has consciously caught up. a tightness across my shoulders, the specific kind of tension that comes from lying very still and trying very hard not to move, as though some instinct in me had already decided that stillness was the safest option available, long before I had any concrete reason to believe I needed protecting from anything at all. The house around me, which had felt merely quiet a few minutes earlier, now felt like it was holding its breath along with me, every ordinary creak and settle I might normally have tuned out suddenly seeming loaded with significance, each one making me flinch slightly under my blanket. I tried, at first, to do what anyone would do in that situation. I tried to ignore it. I kept my eyes closed, told myself it was nothing, told myself that lying awake too long in a dark room does strange things to a person's nerves, that my own mind was simply manufacturing a feeling out of nothing more than fatigue and an overactive imagination. But the feeling didn't fade the way ordinary nervous feelings usually do once you name them and dismiss them. If anything, it deepened, sitting there in my chest like a physical weight, growing heavier the longer I lay there with my eyes shut, refusing to look. Eventually, I couldn't stand it any longer. I opened my eyes. My gaze went, without any conscious decision on my part, directly to that dark alcove across the room, the one place in my bedroom that never received any light at all. And there, in that patch of absolute black, I saw something. Not clearly, not with any sharp detail, but unmistakably present. A hazy outline darker even than the darkness surrounding it. A shape with a suggestion of form to it that had no business being there. I felt every hair on my body rise at once, a full body wave of goosebumps that started at the base of my neck and rolled all the way down my arms. And my heart began pounding hard enough that I could hear it in my own ears. A fast, heavy thudding that seemed to fill the silence of the room. I told myself, in that moment, the same thing anyone tells themselves when faced with something their rational mind refuses to accept. It's nothing. It's just shadows playing tricks on tired eyes. I've stared at that corner 1,000 times before and never seen anything. So why would tonight be any different? I forced my eyes shut again, pulling the blanket up a little tighter around my shoulders, trying very hard to convince my racing heart that there was nothing in that room except me, my bed, and an old wooden closet door that happened to block the light in an inconvenient way. It didn't work. The feeling of being watched didn't fade at all with my eyes closed. If anything, it intensified. That same weighted malice pressing down on me from across the room, patient and unmoving, and something deep in my body, some instinct far older and far more urgent than my rational mind, kept insisting that I needed to look again, that closing my eyes and hoping for the best was not going to make whatever was happening simply stop. I opened my eyes a second time. The shadow was no longer in the alcove. It was standing right beside my bed. I want to try to describe exactly what I saw in that moment, though I have never fully found the words that capture it the way it actually felt to witness. It was bent over me, close enough that if I'd reached out my hand, I might have been able to touch it, hunched forward at an angle that put its face, or whatever passed for a face on something that dark and formless, directly above mine, staring straight down at me with an intensity that I felt more than saw, since there were no features I could actually make out. No eyes in any conventional sense. Nothing that resembled a mouth or a nose or any of the ordinary landmarks a human face gives you to focus on. It was simply a deeper concentration of the same darkness that had filled the alcove, given a rough, hunched shape. The outline of shoulders and a bowed head suggested more than clearly drawn, the edges of it slightly indistinct, in a way that made it difficult for my eyes to settle on any single point. as though looking at it directly required more effort than looking at anything else in the room ever had. And yet I knew with an absolute certainty that bypassed every rational explanation my mind tried to offer that it was looking directly at me, and that it had been standing there, watching me, for some unknown length of time before I ever opened my eyes to find it. Patient in a way that felt deliberate rather than accidental, as though it had been waiting specifically for the moment I would finally look. The room itself felt colder in that instant, or at least it felt that way to me, a chill settling over my skin that had nothing to do with the actual temperature of the house. My own breath suddenly feeling shallow and tight in my chest, as though the air immediately around my bed had thinned somehow, become harder to pull in fully. I remember a smell too, faint and strange, something musty and cold, like the inside of an old, unused closet that had never once been aired out, though our house was clean and well kept, and I had no real explanation for where a smell like that could possibly have come from in the middle of the night in my own bedroom. Every instinct in my body went off at once. I don't remember consciously deciding to move. My hands simply acted on their own, grabbing my pillow and yanking my blanket up and over my head in one single, desperate motion, curling myself into as small and hidden a shape as I could manage underneath the covers, the way a child hides from something they're too scared to look at directly, as though a few inches of fabric could actually provide any real protection from whatever had just been leaning over my bed. I lay there afterwards, shaking, my breathing ragged and too loud in my own ears, absolutely certain that if I lifted the blanket even an inch, I would find that shape still standing there, still bent over the space where my head had been, waiting for me to look again. I cried. I want to admit that plainly, because it's true, and because I think it matters to the honesty of the story. I was a senior in high school, old enough that crying over something in my bedroom felt embarrassing, even in the privacy of my own dark room with nobody else awake to witness it. And I cried anyway, silent, shaking sobs muffled into my pillow, too afraid to make any real noise, too afraid that any sound I made might draw further attention from whatever was standing beside my bed. I don't know how long I lay like that, curled up under my blanket, refusing to look, refusing to move, listening as hard as I could for any sound that might tell me the thing was still there or had finally gone. Eventually, exhausted past the point where fear could keep me conscious any longer, I fell asleep, still hidden completely under the covers, still gripping the edge of the blanket in both fists the way you grip something that feels like your only defense against the dark. I woke up the next morning to ordinary daylight coming through my window. The alcove across the room reduced back to its familiar, unremarkable dimness. Nothing standing beside my bed, nothing waiting in the corner. The whole room looking exactly as it always had. Sunlight catching the same dust on the same shelves it always did. I lay there for a while before getting up, running the previous night over in my mind, trying to convince myself, in the flat, reasonable light of morning, that it had been a dream or a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and too many hours spent staring into the dark, the kind of thing a tired teenage brain manufactures out of nothing more than shadow and imagination. I almost managed to believe it. I got up, got dressed, went about my day. And by the time I got to school that morning, I had mostly talked myself into treating the whole thing as an unusually vivid nightmare. Nothing more. Filing it away in the same mental drawer where I kept every other bad dream I'd ever had, and mostly forgotten within a week, at least until the following weekend when I lay down in that same bed again and remembered exactly how it had felt. That comfortable explanation started to crack a few weeks later, when the doors began. It started small, easy to dismiss the same way I tried to dismiss the shadow in my room. I would be sitting in the living room or upstairs in my bedroom doing homework, and I would hear a door slam somewhere else in the house, sharp and sudden, loud enough to make me jump every time. The sound carrying through the walls with a clarity that made it impossible to mistake for anything else. My first instinct, the first several times it happened, was to assume it was a draft. Some window left cracked open somewhere that I hadn't noticed, catching a gust of wind and yanking a door shut hard enough to echo through the house. I checked more than once for open windows and found none, every latch fastened, every pane sealed exactly as it should have been. I checked whether anyone else was home, upstairs or in another room, someone who might have simply closed a door on their way past without thinking much of it, and found, more than once, that I was completely alone in the house at the time. Every other family member out at work or school or running errands, no explanation for the sound beyond the simple, unsettling fact that it had happened. The strangest instances were the ones where I would go check the door that had supposedly just slammed, only to find it already standing open, exactly the way it had been before I heard the sound, no sign that it had moved at all, let alone slammed shut hard enough to produce the sharp, distinct crack I had clearly heard from another room. I remember standing in front of my own bedroom door on more than one occasion, staring at it, hanging open on its hinges exactly as it always did, trying to reconcile what I was looking at with the sound I had just heard moments earlier. A sound too loud, too specific, too much like an actual door slamming shut to have been my imagination or some trick of the house settling. There was one particular evening, a few weeks into all of this, when I was downstairs alone doing the dishes, everyone else out for the evening. The house quiet except for the running water and the occasional clink of a plate. I heard at that time from directly above me, a hard, flat slam that could only have come from my own bedroom, loud enough that I actually dropped the dish towel I was holding. I stood frozen at the sink for a long moment before I could make myself climb the stairs to check, my hand gripping the railing tighter than it needed to, my footsteps deliberately slow, some part of me not actually wanting to know what I would find at the top. My bedroom door, when I finally reached it, was standing open exactly as I had left it that morning, the room beyond it dim and undisturbed in the late afternoon light. Nothing shifted, nothing fallen, nothing to explain the sound at all. I stood in that doorway for a long time before I made myself step inside, scanning every corner of the room out of habit, my eyes going, almost against my will, straight to that dark alcove across from my bed, empty in the daylight the way it always was, giving no indication of anything at all. I never told my parents about any of it directly, not in full detail. I mentioned the doors once or twice, in passing, framed as a joke, asking whether anyone else had noticed how drafty the house had gotten lately, and got nothing back but shrugs, mild agreement that old houses do strange things sometimes. Nothing that suggested anyone else was experiencing what I was experiencing. Or at least nothing anyone else was willing to admit to out loud. Everyone content to blame it on the age of the house and move on with their evening. I never told anyone about the shadow at all. It felt somehow too private and too strange to put into words for another person, the kind of thing that sounds absurd the moment you try to describe it to someone who wasn't there, who didn't feel that specific, malicious weight pressing down on them in the dark. And I worried, more than anything, that saying it out loud would make it feel more real than I was prepared to handle, that giving it words might somehow invite it closer. I started sleeping differently after that night, though I never fully admitted to myself at the time exactly why. I stopped sleeping on my back, facing the ceiling, instead turning onto my side, facing away from that corner of the room, telling myself it was simply more comfortable that way. A small adjustment that felt purely practical on the surface, and that I never once connected out loud to what I'd seen. I started leaving a small lamp on some nights, just enough light to keep the alcove from disappearing completely into black. Though I told myself that was only because I'd been having trouble sleeping in total darkness lately, nothing more specific than that, an excuse I repeated to myself often enough that I nearly believed it. I noticed, without wanting to examine it too closely, that I had developed a habit of glancing at that corner of the room every single time I walked in. Whether it was the middle of the night or the middle of a bright afternoon, a quick automatic check that took less than a second and that I performed without consciously deciding to. The way you check a mirror out of habit rather than genuine need, a small ritual my body had adopted long before my mind was willing to admit why it felt necessary. The doors kept slamming on and off for months after that, never on any predictable schedule, sometimes going quiet for weeks at a time long enough that I'd start to relax, start to believe whatever had been happening had finally stopped, only for it to start up again without warning, usually late in the evening. Usually when I was home alone or the only one still awake. I never saw a door move on its own, not directly, not with my own eyes catching the actual motion of it swinging shut. I only ever heard it, sharp and sudden from another room, and found, every single time I went to check, a door standing perfectly still, exactly where it had always been, giving no indication that anything had touched it at all. I never saw the shadow again after that first night. Not clearly. Not the way I'd seen it bent over my bed with that malicious intensity radiating off it. But the feeling never fully went away either. That low-grade, prickling sense of being watched from that particular corner of my room, present on some nights more than others. Strong enough on the worst of those nights that I would lie in bed with my eyes deliberately shut, refusing to look toward the alcove no matter how badly some part of me wanted to check, terrified that if I opened my eyes I would find it standing there again, closer than before, and that this time I might not wake up in an ordinary sunlit morning with everything back to normal. I moved out of that house eventually, off to college and then into apartments of my own, and I want to tell you that the feeling stopped the moment I left that particular bedroom behind. That whatever had been in that alcove was somehow tied specifically to that house, that room, that unfortunate arrangement of closet and light fixture that had created the one true patch of darkness deep enough for something to hide inside. Mostly, that's true. I don't feel watched anymore, not the way I did back then, not with that same specific directed malice pressing down on me from across a dark room. I did go back to that house once, years later, visiting for a holiday after my parents had finally moved on themselves and someone else had bought the place. I didn't ask to see my old bedroom. I told myself it was because it would have felt strange and intrusive to ask a stranger to let me wander through their house, and that was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. Standing outside on the street, looking up at the window I knew belonged to what used to be my room, I felt an old, familiar unease settle over me. Faint, but unmistakable, and I found myself, without quite deciding to, checking the angle of the closet from memory, working out in my head exactly where that dark little alcove would still be sitting behind those curtains. Whether the new owners had ever noticed the strange dimness of that corner the way I once had. Whether they had ever glanced toward it in the dark and felt anything at all. But every apartment I've lived in since then, every new bedroom I've ever slept in, I find myself doing the same thing without fail, the very first night I spend in any new space. I walk the room in the dark before I ever try to sleep, checking every corner, every alcove, every patch of shadow deep enough to hide something in, making absolutely certain, with my own eyes, that nothing is standing there waiting before I ever allow myself to climb into bed. I tell myself it's just a habit now, an old superstition left over from a stressful year in high school. Nothing worth taking seriously at all. I do it every single time anyway, without fail, no matter how tired I am or how silly it feels in the moment. And some nights, standing there in an unfamiliar dark room checking corners that have never once given me any reason to be afraid, I still feel it. Just for a moment, that same cold certainty settling low in my chest. And some nights I catch myself wondering what it would mean if one night I finally lift the covers or open my eyes and find that it followed me. All this time, from that one particular room into every dark corner I've slept in since. The house I grew up in was old even by the standards of our town, built sometime around the middle of the 1800s. One of those farmhouses that had been added onto and repaired and modernized in pieces over more than a century and a half, so that walking through it felt a little like walking through a timeline. Newer wiring running through walls that had been standing since before the Civil War. My parents had bought it when I was young, drawn to the wide porch and the thick original beams, and the sheer amount of land that came with it. 2.5 acres, backing up to a stretch of trees that separated us from the nearest neighbor. I loved that house growing up. Loved the creak of the old floorboards and the particular quality of light that came through the wavy old glass in some of the original windows. The kind of glass that distorts everything you look through it just slightly, giving even an ordinary daytime view a strange, dreamlike softness. One of those small architectural quirks I never thought twice about until the night it started to matter. The dining room sat at the front of the house, and it had one enormous window looking directly out onto the porch, tall enough to nearly reach the ceiling. Original to the house as far as anyone could tell. The same wavy old glass in most of the panes, warped just enough over the decades to slightly bend anything seen through it. That porch ran the full width of the front of the house and then wrapped around the side, all the way to a door that led into the kitchen, so that if you were standing on the porch outside that dining room window, you could, if you wanted to, simply walk the length of it and let yourself in through the kitchen without ever stepping off the wood. The living room sat right beside the dining room, connected by a wide open doorway, close enough that if you were sitting on the couch in the living room, you had an almost unobstructed line of sight straight through into the dining room and out through that big front window to the porch beyond it. I want to set the scene properly, because the layout of that house matters enormously to what happened, and because I think about that layout now in a way I never used to before that particular night. The living room, where I usually watched television, sat at an angle that put the couch facing roughly toward the dining room doorway, so that anyone glancing up from the television, even without meaning to, would have a clear sight line straight through to that big window and the porch beyond it. It was, in hindsight, exactly the kind of layout that leaves you exposed in a way you never think about until the moment it matters. I was home from college for a visit, back in my childhood bedroom for a few days, the way you are during breaks, that strange in-between feeling of being both an adult and a kid again the moment you walk through your parents' front door. It was late, well past the hour when the rest of the house had gone to sleep. My mother had already gone up to bed hours earlier, and my father and my sister were both out somewhere that evening. So, for a while, it was just me, alone downstairs, sitting on the living room couch with the television on low. Some show playing that I wasn't paying particularly close attention to. More background noise than entertainment while I scrolled through my phone. The house was quiet in the particular way old houses always get quiet at night. Not silent exactly, but settled into its own low collection of sounds. The occasional creak of a beam contracting as the temperature dropped. The distant hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. The wind moving through the trees at the edge of the property, just audible enough to register, without really being noticed. I had grown up with those sounds, They were as familiar to me as my own heartbeat, the ordinary background noise I'd stopped consciously hearing years earlier, the way you stop hearing traffic if you grow up near a busy road. Familiar enough that it had long since faded into the wallpaper of the place. I heard a small clicking noise that night. I want to be precise about how I describe it, because that specific sound has stayed with me in exact, specific detail in a way most background noises from that night have not. It wasn't loud at all. It wasn't dramatic in the slightest. It was small and sharp, a single distinct click, the kind of sound a fingernail makes against glass, or the kind of sound old window glass sometimes makes on its own when the temperature shifts and the pane settles slightly in its frame. My eyes went, almost involuntarily, toward the source of it, drawn through the open doorway between the living room and the dining room, straight toward that big front window. There was a man standing at the window. I want to describe exactly what I saw, because the image has never left me. It was a silhouette, backlit by nothing since the porch light wasn't on and the night outside was fully dark, but visible anyway against the slightly lighter gray of the sky and the porch railing behind him. A large shape, broad across the shoulders, wearing what looked like a heavy flannel shirt or a work coat, thick enough to bulk out his silhouette, and on his head, unmistakably, a baseball cap, the brim casting an even deeper shadow over whatever features might otherwise have been visible. He was standing perfectly still, close enough to the glass that his outline filled a significant portion of that large window, and he was facing directly into the house. Not glancing around the porch, not looking off toward the yard or the driveway the way someone might if they'd simply wandered up by accident or were checking the wrong house for an address. Facing in, looking, as far as I could tell in that first frozen instant, directly into the living room, directly at the couch, directly. Though I could never be fully certain of this, given the distance and the dark at me. There was something about the stillness of him that struck me even before the fear fully caught up with my body. An absolute lack of the small shifting movements a person naturally makes, even when trying to stand quietly. No weight rocking from one foot to the other, no hand adjusting a collar or a sleeve, nothing at all except that single unbroken outline against the old wavy glass. The wavy quality of that original window pane, the same distortion that had always given daytime views a soft, dreamlike quality, seemed to work against me in that moment, blurring the edges of him just enough that I couldn't make out any detail beyond the basic shape. Couldn't tell whether his hands hung at his sides or were doing something I couldn't see. Couldn't tell whether the shadow where his face should have been held any expression at all. My heart did something in that moment that I still don't have adequate words for. All these years later, a lurching, slamming sensation that felt like it might genuinely do damage. Adrenaline flooding through my whole body so fast it left my fingertips tingling. But I didn't move. I want to explain why. Because in the moment it felt less like a decision and more like an instinct overriding every other impulse in my body. If he was watching me, and every part of me believed in that instant that he genuinely was, I did not want him to know that I had seen him. I sat there on that couch, phone still glowing faintly in my hand, television still playing whatever show had been on, my eyes fixed on that dark shape through the doorway, without turning my head, without changing my posture, without giving away by so much as a flicker that anything at all had registered. I don't know how long I sat like that, though it felt like a genuinely long stretch of time. My whole body rigid with the effort of appearing completely relaxed, my mind racing through options, even as my body stayed perfectly, deliberately still. Eventually, moving as naturally as I could manage, I got up from the couch, the way you'd get up for any ordinary reason, stretching slightly, not looking directly at the window, and made my way toward the stairs at what I hoped looked like an unhurried pace. The moment I reached the bottom step, Out of whatever sightline that window might still have had on me, I stopped pretending. I took the stairs 2 at a time, moving as fast and as quietly as I possibly could, adrenaline carrying me up to the second floor and down the hall to my old bedroom in what felt like seconds. My father had, years earlier, given me an old rifle, a Marlin 336C chambered in .35 caliber, a gun I'd grown up shooting on our own property, comfortable enough with it that my hands knew exactly what to do without my brain having to walk them through each step. I pulled it out, loaded it with hands that were shaking slightly despite how practiced the motion normally was, and then, on some instinct I can't fully explain even now, I also grabbed a combat knife that had belonged to my uncle, a relic he'd carried during his time in Vietnam decades earlier, kept in a drawer in my room more as a family memento than as any practical tool. The kind of object you keep because of who it belonged to, rather than because you ever expect to use it. I don't know why I grabbed it that night. I think some part of me simply wanted every possible option available. Wanted to be armed in more than one way in case the rifle failed me, or I found myself in a situation too close for a long gun to be useful. I made my way back downstairs, rifle in hand, knife secured somewhere on me, moving as quietly as I could manage while my heart continued hammering against my ribs, each stair tread creaking beneath me the way old wood always does, the sound suddenly feeling far louder than it ever had before, as though every ordinary noise in that house had been turned up somehow in the last 10 minutes. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, I did the opposite of everything I'd done 10 minutes earlier. I turned on every light I passed, hallway, living room, dining room, kitchen, flooding the entire downstairs with brightness, wanting whoever was out there to know, unmistakably, that the house was awake now and that I was already coming for them. That whatever advantage darkness might have given them a few minutes earlier was gone. The dining room, fully lit for the first time that evening, looked almost absurdly ordinary as I passed through it. The table and chairs exactly where they always sat. The big front window now reflecting the room back at me rather than showing anything beyond it. The glass turned into a mirror by the brightness inside against the darkness outside. I forced myself to look at it anyway, checking my own reflection against the glass for any hint of a second shape standing behind it, finding nothing but my own pale, tense face staring back. I went straight for the kitchen door, the same one that opened onto the side of that wraparound porch, and as I reached it, I racked the action on the rifle, the sharp metallic sound of it loud and deliberate in the sudden brightness of the kitchen. A sound I hoped would carry clearly through the door and out into the dark, a warning in itself before I'd even said a word. I paused for just a second with my hand on the doorknob, aware in some distant part of my mind of how strange the whole scene would have looked to anyone watching from outside. A college kid standing in a lit kitchen doorway at nearly 3 a.m, rifle loaded, my uncle's old combat knife tucked against my side, about to step out into the dark after a shadow that might have already vanished entirely. I threw the door open and stepped out onto the porch, gun raised, scanning the darkness beyond the reach of the kitchen light spilling out behind me. The cold night air hitting my face all at once, sharp enough to make my eyes water slightly. I said it firmly, without shouting, my voice steadier than I actually felt in that moment. I have a gun. Come out, and I won't shoot you. For a moment, there was nothing. Just the ordinary night sounds of the property, wind in the trees, the distant call of some bird disturbed from its roost, my own breathing loud in my ears. And then I heard it. 2 footsteps, distinct and heavy, landing on the old wooden boards of the porch, coming from around the corner, from the direction of the front of the house, from exactly where that dining room window looked out. I spun toward the sound, rifle already raised, fully prepared in that instant to see someone standing there and to do whatever I needed to do to protect myself and my sleeping mother upstairs. The night air was sharp and cold against my face, the kind of cold that makes every breath visible, and I could feel my own pulse in my temples, a fast, insistent throb that seemed to sync itself with the pounding of my boots against the porch boards as I moved. I came around that corner of the porch with my finger tight against the trigger guard, scanning the full length of the front porch, the big dining room window glowing behind me from the lights I'd left on inside, casting a long rectangle of yellow light out across the boards that made the darkness beyond its edges feel even deeper by comparison. There was nothing there. The porch stretched empty in both directions, nothing standing on it, nothing crouched near the railing, no shape retreating into the darkness of the yard beyond. I stood there for a long moment, gun still raised, heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, waiting for some explanation to present itself, waiting for a shadow to resolve into a person, for some rational answer to arrive and make sense of two heavy, deliberate footsteps that had no visible source. None came. I spent the better part of the next hour walking the full 2.5 acres of that property, rifle in hand the entire time, checking behind the old shed at the back of the lot, checking the tree line where the woods began, checking every corner and shadow the porch light and my own flashlight could reach. The flashlight beam kept catching on ordinary things and making them, for a fraction of a second each time, look like something else entirely. A fence post at the edge of the property, briefly resembling a standing figure before resolving back into weathered wood the instant the light steadied on it. A low bush near the shed taking on. For one heart-stopping moment, the rough shape of shoulders and a bowed head. Every one of those false alarms sent a fresh jolt through my chest, my rifle swinging toward each new shape before my mind had fully caught up with what my eyes were actually seeing. I found nothing. No footprints in the soft ground near the porch that I could definitively attribute to a person rather than to my own boots or the animals that regularly passed through our yard, deer mostly. The occasional raccoon working its way along the edge of the woods. No sign of anyone having climbed the porch railing or crossed the lawn, no broken branches, no disturbed grass, nothing at all except an empty, quiet property and my own racing heartbeat slowly, gradually, beginning to settle as the adrenaline finally started to fade, leaving behind a particular hollow exhaustion that comes after your whole body has been braced for a fight that never actually arrived. I went back inside eventually, checked every door and window twice, made absolutely certain everything was locked, and sat up the rest of that night in the living room with the rifle across my lap and every light in the downstairs still burning, watching that dining room window until the sky outside finally began to lighten toward morning. I remember the particular quality of that vigil, the way the minutes seemed to stretch impossibly long, the way I found myself flinching at every ordinary house sound, every creak of a settling beam suddenly sounding, to my exhausted, wired nerves exactly like the click I'd heard hours earlier. At some point, sometime after 4, I caught myself dozing despite everything, jerking awake with my heart already racing before I'd even fully opened my eyes, certain for one disorienting second that the silhouette was standing in the doorway between the dining room and the living room rather than out at the window, close enough now that it could reach me without ever touching the glass at all. It wasn't there. The doorway was empty, the dining room beyond it undisturbed, and I sat there afterward with the rifle gripped so tightly my knuckles had gone pale, unwilling to let myself doze again for the rest of that long night. My mother never woke up through any of it, and I didn't tell her what had happened until the next day, watching her face go pale as I described the silhouette at the window. The footsteps on the porch, the empty dark where a person should have been standing. She asked me more than once whether I was completely sure I hadn't simply imagined it, exhausted and half asleep on the couch, and I understood why she asked. Understood that it was easier for both of us if there was some ordinary explanation available. But I had not been asleep. I had not been dreaming. I had seen that shape as clearly as I have ever seen anything, and I had heard those two footsteps with the same clarity I hear my own voice when I speak. And no amount of wishing otherwise, in the days and weeks that followed, ever managed to talk me out of what I actually experienced that night. I didn't sleep properly for the rest of that week. Every night, no matter how tired I was, I found myself lying awake, listening for that same small clicking sound, straining to hear footsteps on the porch boards, my whole body tense in a way that made real rest impossible, even after exhaustion had thoroughly worn me down. I kept the rifle within reach in my room every one of those nights, propped against the nightstand instead of stored away in the closet where it normally lived, and more than once I woke myself in the small hours, convinced I'd heard something downstairs, lying rigid in the dark, straining to separate an ordinary house, settling from something that might actually be moving through the rooms below me. I checked that dining room window obsessively every time I passed through the house, glancing at it the way you glance at a mirror out of habit, half expecting, every single time, to see that same broad silhouette standing there again, cap pulled low, facing directly in. I went back to college a few days later, the memory of that night sitting uneasily in the back of my mind the whole drive back, replaying itself in vivid detail every time the highway went quiet enough to let my thoughts wander. I called my parents regularly after that to ask, as casually as I could manage, whether anything else strange had happened around the house, trying not to let the worry show too clearly in my voice each time. For a long while, nothing did. No more clicking sounds, no more silhouettes at the window, no more footsteps on the porch with no explanation behind them. Life at home returned, on the surface at least, to normal, and eventually I stopped asking, stopped needing to ask, the sharp edge of that memory dulling slowly the way memories do with enough time and distance between you and the thing that frightened you. But I never fully let it go. Even now, years later, whenever I visit that house, whenever I find myself sitting on that same living room couch in the evening with the television playing low, I catch myself glancing up through that doorway toward the big dining room window more often than I probably need to, checking the dark glass out of some habit I never consciously decided to develop, half expecting, even now, to see a shape standing there again, patient and unmoving, waiting for me to finally look away long enough to approach. My sister told me once, years after the fact, that she'd started doing the same thing herself, without ever having heard the full details of what happened that night. Some instinct passed between us, without either of us fully explaining why. My father, when I finally told him the full story sometime after that week had passed, listened carefully, and then told me something that has stuck with me ever since. Something that didn't make me feel any better, despite what I think was his intention in saying it. He said that in all his years living in that house, he had heard stories, passed down loosely through neighbors and old-timers in the area, about a man who used to work the property decades before we ever bought it. Someone who had, according to the stories, disappeared from town under circumstances nobody could quite agree on or fully explain. Some saying he'd simply moved away, others insisting he'd never actually left at all, that he was still out there somewhere on the land he used to work, unwilling or unable to move on from it. My father told me this the way you tell a story you don't fully believe yourself, half joking, trying to lighten the mood, but I noticed, even as he said it, that he avoided looking directly at that dining room window while he spoke, his eyes drifting toward it and then away again, the same way mine had been doing for days, and I never quite worked up the nerve to ask him whether he'd ever seen anything himself. I have never found out who or what was standing at that window that night, never found any footprints, any evidence, any rational explanation that fully accounts for two solid footsteps on an empty porch that vanished the instant I came around the corner. I have stopped actively looking for one, mostly because every explanation I've ever tried to construct has fallen apart under the simple, stubborn fact of what I actually saw and heard with my own senses that night. What I have not stopped doing in all the years since is checking that window every single time I walk into that house after dark. Some small, permanent part of me convinced that if I ever stop checking, even once, I will look up from the couch to find that same broad shadow standing there again, closer to the glass than it was before, waiting patiently for me to finally forget to look.